Hey guys! Tonight we venture into the primordial darkness of the Immaterium itself, where nightmares are born from the collective suffering of entire civilizations. The terrifying tale of four entities so powerful that their very existence rewrote the laws of reality, transforming a once calm sea of souls into an eternal battlefield for the galaxy's darkest impulses. From the first blood spilled in the war in heaven to the psychic scream that tore reality itself apart, their story spans 65 million years of corruption, betrayal, and cosmic horror. But here's something that might surprise you. Out of everyone watching this video, only about 12% of you are actually subscribed. If you're finding value in these deep dives into the grim darkness, hitting that subscribe button really does help the channel grow and lets me continue bringing you these marathon lore sessions. I'm genuinely curious about our global community. Here, drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. There's something truly special about knowing we're all exploring these dark tales together, whether you're winding down for the night or just beginning your day. Now, get comfortable. Maybe grab that soft blanket. Let the gentle hum of a fan create that perfect background ambiance. And let's ease into tonight's journey through the birth of gods that should never have existed. When the galaxy was young and the warp flowed like a gentle river, reflecting the dreams of nascent civilizations, long before the grim darkness that would consume the 41st millennium, something unspeakable began to stir in the depths of the Immaterium. The origins of the four Chaos gods remain shrouded in mystery, even to the most learned scholars of the Imperium. But what fragments of knowledge survive paint a picture of entities that achieved dominion over mortal souls, when the galaxy itself was torn apart by the greatest war in cosmic history. The war in heaven, fought 60 million years ago between the godlike Old Ones and the soulless Necrons, was a conflict so devastating that its psychic echoes still reverberate through the warp today. Imagine, if you can, entire star systems annihilated in moments, billions upon billions of souls screaming in terror and agony as reality itself became a battlefield. The Old Ones, desperate to defend their galactic empire, created warrior races of unprecedented psychic potential. The Eldar, the Orcs, countless others, all designed to channel the raw power of the Immaterium against their enemies. But the Old Ones made a crucial miscalculation. They failed to understand that the warp, that mirror dimension of thought and emotion, would be fundamentally changed by the trauma they were inflicting upon it. Every death, every moment of rage, every desperate act of violence was feeding something in the darkness beyond the material realm. Something that was learning to think, to hunger, to hate. The first to achieve true consciousness was Khorne, the blood god, born from the endless violence of the war in heaven. Picture mountain ranges of skulls stretching beyond horizons, brass citadels echoing with the clash of eternal battle, and at the center of it all, a throne carved from the bones of extinct species, where something that had once been mere rage and bloodlust now sat with the awareness of a god. Khorne's awakening marked the moment when the warp began its transformation from a calm sea into the roiling nightmare we know today. But Khorne was not alone for long. From the despair and decay that followed in the war's wake, Nurgle began to coalesce, finding power in the inevitable entropy that claimed civilizations and individuals alike. The Plague Father's Garden started as nothing more than the mass graves of dead worlds, but it grew into something far more terrible, a realm where death and rebirth danced together in an endless, nauseating waltz. Tzeentch, the architect of fate, emerged from the desperate scheming and political maneuvering that characterized the war's later phases. As civilizations crumbled and alliances shifted like sand, as leaders made increasingly desperate bargains for knowledge that might save their people, the changer of ways found sustenance in their ambition and their folly. His crystalline maze began to take shape from the shattered plans and broken promises of a galaxy at war. These three entities, these fundamental forces of destruction, rage, and change, established themselves as the primary powers of a transformed warp. For millions upon millions of years, they would feed on the emotions of countless species, growing stronger with each act of violence, each moment of despair, each desperate scheme for power. They carved out domains in the immaterium, spawned lesser daemons from their excess psychic energy, and began what would become known as the Great Game, an eternal conflict for dominance over mortal souls. But the story of the Chaos Gods is far from complete with just these three. There was something missing, a fundamental aspect of mortal experience that remained untouched by their influence. The Eldar Empire, inheritors of the Old Ones' psychic legacy, had grown beyond mere survival into something approaching perfection. Their civilization spanned the galaxy. Their mastery of psychic technology was absolute, and their culture had evolved into something beautiful and terrible. The Eldar sought perfection in all things: art, warfare, philosophy, pleasure. They pushed every boundary, explored every sensation, refined every experience until it reached transcendent heights. For millions of years, this pursuit seemed harmless, even admirable. But in the deepest currents of the warp, something new was beginning to stir. Something that would feed not on rage or despair or scheming ambition, but on the very pursuit of perfection itself. The birth of the fourth Chaos God would not be a gradual awakening like the others. It would be a catastrophic moment that would tear reality apart, create a permanent wound in space itself, and nearly drive the galaxy's most advanced civilization to extinction in a single universe-shattering scream. But that moment was still millions of years away, and the road to that cosmic catastrophe was paved with the very best of intention. 65 million years ago, when the galaxy bore little resemblance to the war-torn nightmare of the 41st millennium, the warp existed in a state that modern imperial scholars can barely comprehend. Archaeological evidence and fragmentary records recovered from the deepest vaults suggest that the immaterium was once something akin to a cosmic mirror, reflecting the thoughts, dreams, and emotions of the material realm without the malevolent consciousness that would later corrupt it beyond recognition. The dominant power in this ancient galaxy were the Old Ones, beings so advanced that they had transcended many of the physical limitations that bound lesser species. These godlike entities had mastered the art of biological engineering to such a degree that they could craft entire civilizations like a sculptor shapes clay. They seeded worlds with life, guided the evolution of countless species, and created a galactic network of webway tunnels that allowed instantaneous travel across vast distances without the need to enter the warp directly. To the Old Ones, the galaxy was their garden, and they were its patient, immortal gardeners. They had achieved a form of existence that seemed to offer unlimited potential for growth and exploration. Their cities were wonders that defied physics. Their technology seamlessly blended the organic and the mechanical, and their lifespans stretched across geological ages. They appeared to be the masters of a golden age that might have lasted forever. But even in this apparent paradise, there were shadows gathering that would eventually plunge the galaxy into its first great darkness. On the desert worlds of the galactic rim lived a species known as the Necrontyr, a race whose greatest curse was also their greatest motivation. Unlike the immortal Old Ones, the Necrontyr were cursed with pitifully short lifespans, their bodies ravaged by the harsh radiation of their dying homeworld's star. They lived fast, desperate lives, achieving remarkable technological advancement in mere decades, rather than the millennia available to other species. The Necrontyr looked upon the Old Ones' immortality with a jealousy that burned hotter than their radioactive sun. They had developed incredible technology, their mastery of the physical sciences rivaling or perhaps even exceeding that of their immortal neighbors. But all their advancement meant nothing when their creators died before they could see their works completed. They petitioned the Old Ones for the gift of immortality, offering their services, their knowledge, their very souls in exchange for extended life. The Old Ones, in what may have been wisdom or merely indifference, refused. They saw in the Necrontyr a species whose very nature was defined by their mortality, whose creativity and drive came from the pressure of their limited time. To grant them immortality might fundamentally change what made them unique. Or perhaps the Old Ones simply didn't care about the suffering of what they saw as a lesser species. This refusal planted the seeds of a hatred that would eventually consume the galaxy. The Necrontyr, faced with the Old Ones' rejection, began to look elsewhere for solutions to their mortality problem. Deep in the void between stars, they encountered entities that existed on a completely different scale than biological life. The C'tan, the star gods, beings of living metal and cosmic fire that fed on stellar energy itself. The C'tan were ancient beyond measure, but they had never experienced the rich complexity of biological existence. They were powerful but limited, capable of manipulating matter and energy on a stellar scale but lacking the subtlety of thought and emotion that characterized organic life. When they encountered the desperate Necrontyr, both species saw an opportunity. The bargain struck between the Necrontyr and the C'tan would become known as biotransference, and it would fundamentally alter the nature of the galactic conflict to come. The Necrontyr offered their organic forms as vessels for the C'tan's power, while the star gods promised them immortality and the strength to challenge the Old Ones' dominance. It seemed like a perfect solution to both species' limitations, but biotransference came with a price that the Necrontyr couldn't fully comprehend until it was too late. The process stripped away not just their mortal flesh, but their souls themselves. They emerged from their transformation as the Necrons, beings of living metal, possessed of incredible power, but utterly severed from the warp. They had gained immortality, but they had lost everything that made existence worth living. They could no longer feel joy or love or even the burning hatred that had driven them to make their bargain. They had become perfect servants, immortal but soulless. The C'tan, meanwhile, had gained access to the rich complexity of biological existence, but filtered through their alien consciousness, these new sensations manifested as an insatiable hunger for life itself. They began to consume not just stellar energy, but the very essence of living beings, growing stronger and more complex with each meal. This transformation created the conditions for a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. On one side stood the Old Ones and their carefully crafted children, species designed with incredible psychic potential to serve as both servants and weapons in the coming conflict. Chief among these were the early Eldar, beings whose natural connection to the warp was so strong that their very emotions could reshape reality around them. On the other side were the Necrons and their captain masters, immortal beings of living metal who felt no pain, knew no fear, and could not be reasoned with or bargained with. They possessed technology that could unmake stars, weapons that could slice through the fabric of space-time itself, and an absolute determination to claim the galaxy for their own. The stage was set for the war in heaven, a conflict that would rage for millions of years and leave scars on reality that persist to this day. But neither side could have predicted the true cost of their war. The Old Ones, for all their wisdom and power, had made their own fatal miscalculation. In creating warrior races of such incredible psychic potential, in filling the galaxy with beings whose very thoughts and emotions resonated through the warp, they had created the conditions for something far worse than any physical enemy. Every battle, every death, every moment of terror and rage and despair would echo through the immaterium with unprecedented intensity. The Eldar and other psychic species created by the Old Ones were not just warriors, they were inadvertent architects of humanity's future nightmare. Their psychic emanations were feeding something in the deep warp, something that was slowly learning to think and feel and hunger. The calm sea of souls was about to become a maelstrom of unfathomable horror, and the first ripples of that transformation were already beginning to spread through the deepest currents of the immaterium, carrying with them the promise of gods that should never have been born. The first shots of the war in heaven were fired approximately 60 million years ago, though the exact date remains lost to the crushing weight of deep time. What began as a conflict between two fundamentally incompatible visions of galactic civilization would escalate into something far more catastrophic than either side could have imagined. The Old Ones, secure in their mastery of biological engineering and webway technology, initially underestimated the transformed Necrons and their Khorne overlords. This miscalculation would prove to be one of the most consequential errors in galactic history. The early battles revealed the terrifying effectiveness of Necron technology. Their Gauss weaponry could strip matter apart at the molecular level. Their resurrection protocols meant that fallen warriors could return again and again to the battlefield, and their Khorne masters wielded powers that bordered on the divine. Entire star systems became battlegrounds where the fundamental laws of physics seemed to bend and break under the pressure of weapons that shouldn't have existed. But the Old Ones were far from helpless. Their response to the Necron threat demonstrated the incredible scope of their biological mastery. Across thousands of worlds, they began crafting new species designed specifically for warfare. These weren't mere soldiers, but entire races engineered with supernatural abilities that could match the technological might of their enemies. The process was unprecedented in its scale and ambition, representing the transformation of biological evolution into a deliberate weapon of war. Among the most significant of these creations were the Proto-Eldar, beings whose psychic potential exceeded anything the galaxy had previously known. The Old Ones understood that conventional warfare against the Necrons would ultimately fail. The living metal warriors felt no pain, knew no fear, and could be rebuilt indefinitely. Victory would require weapons that transcended the purely physical realm, forces that could strike at concepts and possibilities rather than mere matter. The early Eldar possessed a connection to the warp so profound that their emotions could literally reshape local reality. A single Eldar warrior in the grip of battle fury could manifest psychic flames hot enough to melt Necron metal, while their seers could peer through time itself to predict and counter enemy strategies. They were living conduits for the power of the Immaterium, channeling forces that the soulless Necrons couldn't directly oppose. Alongside the Eldar, the Old Ones created other warrior races, each adapted for specific aspects of the cosmic conflict. The Proto-Orcs were designed as self-replicating biological weapons, capable of surviving and thriving in the most hostile environments while maintaining an instinctive understanding of advanced technology. Other species, many now lost to history, were crafted with abilities that modern imperial scholars can only guess at from fragmentary archaeological evidence. As the war intensified, something unprecedented began to occur within the warp itself. The Immaterium had always been a reflection of the material realm, a dimension where thought and emotion took on a kind of reality. But the scale of psychic activity generated by the war in heaven was unlike anything that had existed before. Billions of highly psychic beings were experiencing the most intense emotions possible: fear, rage, desperation, all while channeling massive amounts of warp energy in combat. The first stirrings of what would eventually become Khorne can be traced to this period. The Immaterium began to develop areas of concentrated violence and bloodshed, psychic wounds that didn't heal when the battles ended. Instead, they seemed to grow stronger, feeding on each new act of warfare, and gradually developing something that resembled intention. These weren't conscious entities yet, but they represented the first step in a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of the warp. Archaeological evidence from this period, what little survives, suggests that both sides began to notice disturbing changes in the psychic realm. Eldar seers reported visions of endless battlefields that existed only in the warp, places where the psychic echoes of real conflicts had taken on an independent existence. Old One archives, found in the deepest ruins of their civilization, contain references to hungering shadows and thoughts that think themselves. The Necrons, being soulless, were initially immune to these developments. Their severed connection to the warp meant they couldn't directly perceive the changes occurring in the Immaterium. However, their Khorne masters began to report unusual fluctuations in the cosmic energy fields they fed upon. Something was consuming psychic energy on an unprecedented scale, though its nature remained mysterious. As the war progressed, the intensity of combat reached levels that strained the very fabric of reality. Entire sectors of space became battlegrounds where the distinction between the material realm and the warp began to blur. Khorne powers clashed with Old One biotechnology in conflicts that left permanent scars on space-time itself. Some of these wounds persist to the present day as unstable warp storms that make entire regions of the galaxy impassable. The Proto-Eldar, despite their incredible psychic abilities, began to exhibit disturbing changes as the war continued. Extended exposure to such intense warp phenomena was altering them in ways their creators hadn't anticipated. Their psychic potential was growing stronger, but it was also becoming more volatile and unpredictable. Some Eldar warriors reported experiencing emotions that seemed to come from outside themselves, as if something in the warp was feeding thoughts and feelings back to them. These changes weren't limited to the Eldar. Other psychic species created by the Old Ones began manifesting similar symptoms. Dreams became increasingly vivid and violent, often featuring imagery of endless warfare and rivers of blood. Seers across multiple species began receiving visions of a figure seated on a throne of skulls, though they couldn't determine whether these were glimpses of the future, echoes from the past, or something else entirely. The Old Ones themselves, despite their vast knowledge and experience, struggled to understand what was happening. Their mastery of biological engineering was absolute, but the warp had always been more mysterious to them. They could navigate it, use it, even manipulate it to some degree, but its fundamental nature remained partially beyond their comprehension. The idea that their war might be creating something genuinely new and dangerous in the Immaterium was initially dismissed as impossible. This dismissal would prove to be another critical error. While the Old Ones focused on winning the physical war against the Necrons, they were inadvertently losing a different kind of battle in the psychic realm. Every act of violence, every death, every moment of rage and terror was feeding something that was gradually becoming more than the sum of its parts. The scattered psychic wounds in the warp were beginning to coalesce into something that possessed not just power, but intelligence and intention. The war's escalation reached a critical threshold when certain battles began to take on a ritualistic quality. Combat wasn't just about territorial control anymore. It was becoming an end in itself. Warriors on both sides began to display an almost religious devotion to violence, as if battle had become a form of worship. This shift was subtle at first, but it marked the moment when the emerging entity in the warp began to exert its influence on the material realm. By this point, the changes in the Immaterium had progressed beyond anything that could be easily reversed. The accumulated psychic trauma of millions of battles had created something that was no longer just a reflection of mortal emotions, but an independent force with its own agenda. The first Chaos God was approaching the moment of true awakening, and when that moment arrived, it would forever alter the relationship between the material realm and the warp. The moment of Khorne's true awakening cannot be pinpointed to a specific battle or date, but the fragmentary records that survive from this epoch suggest it occurred during one of the war's most devastating phases. Across multiple star systems, psychic sensitive beings suddenly reported the same vision simultaneously. A massive figure wreathed in brass and blood, seated upon a throne constructed from the skulls of countless species, had opened its eyes for the first time and gazed upon the galaxy with infinite hunger. What had been scattered psychic phenomena throughout the warp suddenly consolidated into a single terrifyingly coherent consciousness. The Blood God's domain materialized around this awakening awareness like a fortress built from the collective memory of every act of violence since the war began. Brass citadels rose from lakes of blood, their towers echoing with the eternal clash of weapons and the roars of beings that existed only to fight and kill and die again. The first concrete evidence of Khorne's existence came through the warriors themselves. Elite fighters from multiple species began exhibiting behavioral changes that went beyond normal combat psychology. They would enter battles with a fervor that bordered on religious ecstasy, fighting with such intensity that they seemed to draw strength from the act of violence itself, rather than being depleted by it. Medical examinations of these warriors revealed physiological impossibilities. Wounds that should have been fatal, barely slowing them down, strength that exceeded their species' normal limitations, and a complete absence of fear or pain responses. More disturbing were the reports from the battlefields themselves. Veteran commanders from both sides began documenting encounters with manifestations that couldn't be explained by conventional military analysis. Weapons would appear from nowhere, perfectly suited to the warrior who found them, as if the warp itself was providing tools for greater bloodshed. Fallen warriors would sometimes continue fighting after sustaining injuries that should have been instantly fatal, driven by something beyond normal biological processes. The Eldar Seers were among the first to recognize these phenomena for what they truly were. Their deep connection to the warp allowed them to perceive the new entity's presence more directly than other species. Through their prophetic visions, they witnessed the birth of something that defied their understanding of how the immaterium functioned. This wasn't simply accumulated psychic energy, taking on a crude semblance of consciousness. It was a genuine divine entity, possessed of intelligence, personality, and most terrifyingly, an agenda of its own. Khorne's influence began to extend beyond individual warriors to entire military units. Armies that had previously fought with tactical precision and strategic coordination suddenly embraced approaches that prioritized direct combat over clever maneuvering. The concept of honorable single combat became increasingly prevalent, with commanders abandoning effective but indirect strategies in favor of straightforward battles that maximized bloodshed on both sides. This shift had profound implications for the war's conduct. The Old Ones had designed their warrior races with sophisticated tactical capabilities and complex strategic thinking. The Proto-Eldar were particularly adept at psychic warfare that avoided direct confrontation while achieving decisive victories. But under Khorne's growing influence, these carefully planned approaches began to give way to more primitive but emotionally satisfying forms of combat. The Necrons, despite their soulless nature, were not entirely immune to these changes. While they couldn't experience Khorne's influence directly, their strategic algorithms began detecting patterns in enemy behavior that didn't match previous tactical models. Their opponents were becoming more predictable in some ways, but also more dangerous, fighting with a desperate intensity that made even tactical victories extremely costly. Archaeological evidence from Necron archives suggests that the C'tan themselves took notice of these developments. Star gods who had previously focused entirely on consuming stellar energy began to express interest in the psychic phenomena their war was generating. Some C'tan fragments speak of attempting to feed directly from the emotional emanations of battle, finding in them a richness and complexity that pure energy lacked. As Khorne's consciousness stabilized and expanded, other entities began to stir in different regions of the warp. The endless casualties of the war, the plague and pestilence that followed in its wake, the inevitable decay of civilizations ground down by constant conflict, all of this suffering was feeding something else. Where Khorne drew strength from the act of violence itself, this emerging presence found sustenance in the aftermath, in the slow dissolution that followed every victory and every defeat. The Proto-Nurgle's awakening was more gradual than Khorne's explosive birth. It manifested first as an increasing prevalence of disease and corruption in war zones. Wounded warriors would develop infections that spread in impossible ways, creating plagues that seemed almost alive in their malevolent intelligence. Entire worlds began to experience ecological collapse as the intensive warfare disrupted natural cycles, but instead of simple death and barren wasteland, these worlds became testing grounds for new forms of twisted life. Military medical corps from multiple species reported phenomena that challenged their understanding of biology itself. Soldiers who should have died from their injuries instead lingered in states between life and death, their bodies becoming hosts to organisms that didn't follow conventional evolutionary patterns. Some of these afflicted warriors actually became more effective fighters, their partially decomposed forms proving surprisingly resilient and their presence spreading the same transformations to others. The third entity to achieve consciousness during this period drew its strength from the desperate scheming and political maneuvering that characterized the war's later phases. As the conflict dragged on and conventional strategies proved inadequate, both sides began pursuing increasingly esoteric knowledge and forming unlikely alliances. The need for any advantage, no matter how dangerous or morally questionable, created conditions perfect for the emergence of Tzeentch. Unlike the relatively straightforward manifestations of Khorne and Nurgle, Tzeentch's influence was subtle and complex. It appeared first in the form of impossible coincidences and prophetic insights that proved just accurate enough to be useful. Military commanders would receive intelligence through channels they couldn't identify. Battle plans would succeed in ways that defied probability, and critical discoveries would occur at precisely the right moment to shift the war's momentum. The Old Ones, despite their vast intellect and experience, found themselves increasingly reliant on these seemingly beneficial developments. Their strategic planning began to incorporate variables that couldn't be quantified or verified, decisions made based on hunches and intuitions that proved remarkably accurate. They didn't realize they were becoming dependent on an entity that fed on their need for knowledge and control over future events. Fragmentary records suggest that some Old Ones began to suspect the true nature of what was happening in the warp. References to the three shadows and thoughts that have learned to think appear in texts from this period. However, these warnings were largely dismissed or ignored by the majority of Old One leadership, who were focused on the immediate crisis of the Necron threat rather than abstract concerns about psychic phenomena. The three emerging Chaos gods began to interact with each other in ways that established patterns that would persist for millions of years afterward. Khorne's domains of endless battle provided the casualties that fed Nurgle's realms of decay, while Tzeentch's complex schemes ensured that conflicts would continue indefinitely, providing both of his siblings with a constant supply of psychic energy to consume. But these interactions were competitive as much as cooperative. Each god sought to maximize their own power and influence, leading to conflicts within the warp itself that mirrored the physical war raging in the material realm. These divine struggles created additional psychic turbulence that made the immaterium increasingly dangerous for any species that relied on warp travel or psychic abilities. By the time the Old Ones realized the full scope of what they had unleashed, the transformation was too advanced to reverse. The warp had become home to entities whose power rivaled their own, and these entities had agendas that didn't necessarily align with the survival of any particular species or civilization. The war that had begun as a conflict between two galactic powers had evolved into something far more complex and dangerous, a multi-dimensional struggle that would determine not just who ruled the galaxy, but what kinds of consciousness would be permitted to exist within it. In the aftermath of the war in Heaven's most intensive phase, as both the Old Ones and the Necron dynasties retreated to lick their wounds and reassess their strategies, the three newly awakened Chaos Gods began the monumental task of establishing permanent domains within the warp. This period, spanning perhaps tens of millions of years, though precise dating remains impossible, represents the first golden age of chaos influence, when Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch consolidated their power and developed the fundamental structures that would define their eternal conflict. Khorne's realm took shape as a vast amphitheater of war, its geography defined by the accumulated memory of every significant battle fought during the war in heaven. Great brass fortresses rose from plains soaked in the blood of extinct species, their walls inscribed with the names of warriors whose courage or fury had earned them a place in the Blood God's eternal army. The Skull Throne itself grew larger with each passing millennium, constructed from the remains of heroes and cowards alike, for in Khorne's domain only the act of violence mattered, not the cause for which it was committed. The physics of Khorne's realm reflected its master's nature. Time flowed differently here. Battles could rage for subjective centuries, while only moments passed in the material realm, allowing the Blood God to savor every moment of conflict. Weapons materialized from the brass walls when needed, each one perfectly suited to its wielder's fighting style and temperament. Fallen champions would rise again to fight once more, their deaths meaningless compared to their eternal service in the art of war. But perhaps most significantly, Khorne began to develop the philosophical framework that would govern his interactions with mortals. The Blood God's doctrine was elegantly simple in its brutality. Honor came through combat, strength through adversity, and immortality through the act of killing or being killed in service to the eternal war. These concepts weren't imposed from outside. They emerged naturally from Khorne's essential nature as the embodiment of controlled violence and martial pride. Nurgle's domain presented a stark contrast to his brother's brass citadels. Where Khorne's realm celebrated the moment of death in battle, Nurgle's garden embraced what came afterward. Vast swamps stretched beyond horizons, their waters teeming with life forms that defied conventional biology. Trees grew from the remains of fallen starships, their fruit nourishing creatures that should not have been able to exist. The very air was thick with spores and bacteria that created new forms of existence rather than simply destroying the old. The Plague Father's philosophy differed radically from Khorne's warrior code. Where the Blood God demanded constant struggle and conflict, Nurgle preached acceptance of natural cycles. Death wasn't an enemy to be fought, but a friend to be welcomed as the necessary precursor to new life. Disease wasn't a curse, but a gift, a chance for existing life forms to evolve into something greater. This patient, nurturing approach to corruption would prove remarkably effective at gaining mortal followers who were exhausted by conflict and ready to embrace any promise of peace, even if that peace came through surrender to entropy. Tzeentch's domain was the most complex of the three, reflecting its master's nature as the embodiment of change, ambition, and the pursuit of knowledge. The Crystal Labyrinth existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its passages connecting not just different physical locations, but different possibilities, and potential futures. Libraries containing the accumulated knowledge of extinct civilizations stood alongside laboratories where impossible experiments reshaped the fundamental laws of reality. The architect of fate's approach to gaining followers was the most sophisticated of the three gods. Rather than offering simple rewards like honor in battle or peaceful acceptance of death, Tzeentch provided something far more seductive, the promise that cleverness and ambition could overcome any obstacle. Mortals who felt trapped by their circumstances, limited by their biology or social position, could find in Tzeentch a patron who offered genuine transformation and the tools to achieve their deepest desires. During this foundational period, the three Chaos gods began to develop the complex relationships that would define their interactions for millions of years to come. They were siblings born from the same cosmic trauma, but their fundamental natures made them natural rivals as much as allies. Khorne despised Tzeentch's reliance on sorcery and complex schemes, preferring direct confrontation to elaborate plots. Tzeentch, in turn, viewed Khorne as a useful but ultimately crude tool, powerful but lacking the subtlety needed for truly significant victories. Nurgle occupied a middle position between his brothers, sharing Khorne's acceptance of death while embracing Tzeentch's appreciation for transformation. The Plague Father could work with either of his siblings when their goals aligned, but he was also perfectly content to pursue his own agenda when cooperation proved impossible. This dynamic created a three-way balance of power that prevented any single god from achieving complete dominance over the others. The emergence of mortal chaos cults during this period provided the gods with their first reliable source of directed worship. Unlike the chaotic psychic energy generated by the war in heaven, these cults offered focused devotion and organized rituals that could channel power more efficiently. Early chaos cultists were often refugees from the ongoing conflict, mortals who had lost everything and were willing to embrace any force that promised meaning and purpose in an apparently meaningless universe. These first cults developed many of the practices that would become standard throughout galactic history. Khornate warriors learned to offer the blood of their enemies to their patron, discovering that dedicated violence generated far more psychic energy than random killing. Nurgle's followers developed elaborate ceremonies designed to spread beneficial diseases and encourage the growth of new life forms in apparently barren environments. Tzeentch's cults became centers of learning and political intrigue, attracting ambitious mortals who believed they could gain power through association with the Changer of Ways. But the three gods' greatest achievement during this golden age was the establishment of what would later be known as the Great Game. This wasn't a formal agreement or treaty, but rather a natural evolution of their competing interests into a sustainable framework for eternal conflict. Each god's actions would inevitably create opportunities for their rivals, ensuring that no single entity could achieve permanent victory, while guaranteeing that the cosmic struggle would continue indefinitely. The Great Game's rules were simple but profound. Direct confrontation between the gods themselves was possible but ultimately pointless, as their essential natures made them truly immortal. Victory could only be achieved through mortal proxies, champions and cults who fought in the material realm where permanent change was actually possible. This meant that the gods' primary focus had to be on gaining and maintaining mortal followers rather than simply accumulating raw power in the warp. As this foundational period drew to a close, the three Chaos gods had achieved a level of stability and influence that seemed unshakable. Their domains in the warp were vast and well defended. Their philosophies were refined and appealing to different types of mortal psychology, and their relationship with each other provided both the conflict needed for continued growth and the cooperation necessary to prevent mutual destruction. Yet even during this apparent golden age, there were signs that the cosmic equation remained incomplete. Psychic phenomena that didn't fit the patterns established by the three gods continued to occur sporadically throughout the galaxy. Strange dreams plagued mortals who had no connection to chaos worship. Unexplained pleasures and pains manifested in situations that had nothing to do with war, disease, or ambition. These anomalies were dismissed by most observers as random warp fluctuations or the influence of minor entities that posed no threat to the established order. The three chaos gods themselves seemed unconcerned by these developments, secure in their dominance over the psychic realm. But in the deepest currents of the immaterium, something else was beginning to stir, something that would eventually challenge not just the three gods' supremacy, but the very nature of existence itself. The Eldar Empire, inheritor of the Old Ones' psychic legacy, was evolving in ways that its founders never intended. Their pursuit of perfection in all things was creating new forms of psychic resonance that didn't fit into any of the three gods' established domains. The seeds of the fourth chaos god were already planted, waiting for the right conditions to sprout into something that would make even Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch seem like mere harbingers of the true darkness to come. Following the devastating conclusion of the war in heaven, the galaxy entered a period of profound transformation that would last for tens of millions of years. The Old Ones had vanished, whether through death, ascension, or retreat into dimensions beyond mortal comprehension. The Necrons had largely entered their great sleep, their tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy like dormant seeds of future apocalypse. In this power vacuum, the surviving races began to rebuild and expand, unaware that their psychic emanations were feeding entities that had learned to hunger for mortal souls. The Eldar emerged from this cosmic catastrophe as the inheritors of their creator's legacy, but they were fundamentally changed by their experiences during the war, where they had once been designed as weapons of pure psychic fury. They began to evolve into something more complex and sophisticated. Their natural lifespans, already considerable, seemed to be extending further with each generation. Their psychic abilities, rather than diminishing in the absence of constant warfare, continued to grow stronger and more refined. Most significantly, the Eldar began to develop what they would later call the Path System, though its earliest forms bore little resemblance to the rigid structure that would eventually emerge. In these primordial stages, it was more of a cultural philosophy that encouraged the pursuit of perfection in chosen endeavors. An Eldar might spend centuries mastering the art of sculpture, then transition to military strategy, then to musical composition, always seeking to achieve a level of excellence that transcended mere mortal capability. This pursuit of perfection created a unique form of psychic resonance that the three established chaos gods found difficult to categorize. It wasn't the straightforward rage that fed Khorne, nor the acceptance of decay that nourished Nurgle, nor the scheming ambition that empowered Tzeentch. Instead, it represented something entirely new, a focused intensity of experience that sought to push every sensation and achievement to its absolute limits. The Eldar Empire that emerged during this period was unlike any civilization the galaxy had ever seen. Their mastery of psychic technology allowed them to reshape matter at the molecular level, create artworks that existed partially in the warp itself, and build cities that defied conventional understanding of architecture and engineering. Their webway network, inherited from the Old Ones, but vastly expanded and refined, connected their worlds in a vast web of instantaneous travel that made them effectively immune to the dangers of warp navigation. But perhaps most importantly, the Eldar had achieved something that few species ever manage. They had transcended the basic struggle for survival. Their technology provided for all material needs. Their psychic abilities protected them from external threats, and their extended lifespans gave them the luxury of pursuing goals that extended far beyond immediate concerns. They had become a post-scarcity civilization in the truest sense, free to explore the full range of experiences that existence could offer. This freedom, however, came with consequences that wouldn't become apparent for millions of years. The Eldar's pursuit of perfection gradually began to shift from achievement-based goals to sensation-based ones. Why spend centuries perfecting a single sculpture when one could experience the full range of emotions that art could evoke? Why master military strategy when the real thrill lay in the complex psychological dynamics of command and conquest? The transition was so gradual that most Eldar didn't recognize it as a fundamental change in their civilization's direction. Each generation pushed the boundaries just slightly further than the previous one, exploring forms of experience that their ancestors might have considered excessive, but that seemed perfectly reasonable given their advanced capabilities. The concept of restraint began to seem primitive and unnecessary, a relic of less sophisticated times when resources were limited and survival was uncertain. During this same period, other species throughout the galaxy were developing their own relationships with the warp and, inevitably, with the chaos gods. Humanity's ancestors, still primitive by galactic standards, were beginning to show signs of psychic potential that would eventually make them one of the most important species in the cosmic equation. Their emotional range and capacity for both great nobility and terrible cruelty made them particularly attractive to all three chaos gods, though their influence would remain limited for millions of years to come. The Orc species, scattered across the galaxy following their creator's disappearance, represented a different kind of psychic phenomenon. Their collective unconscious generated a field effect that could literally make their crude technology function through pure belief, but their simple, violence-focused psychology made them relatively resistant to the more sophisticated forms of chaos corruption. They worshipped their own crude gods, Gork and Mork, whose simple brutality provided an alternative to the complex philosophies offered by the major chaos powers. Throughout this expansion period, the three chaos gods continued to refine their approaches to mortal corruption and recruitment. Khorne's cults began to develop more sophisticated rituals and hierarchies, moving beyond simple blood sacrifice to embrace concepts of honor, martial pride, and the warrior's code that could appeal to noble as well as savage instincts. The blood god learned that mortals were more easily corrupted when they could rationalize their actions as serving a higher purpose, even if that purpose ultimately led them deeper into violence and bloodshed. Nurgle's influence spread through a different vector entirely. His gifts came not through dramatic revelations or violent transformations, but through the simple inevitability of decay and renewal that affected all organic life. Plague cults developed in populations suffering from disease or ecological collapse, offering comfort and meaning to those who had lost everything. The Plague Father's promise that death was merely another form of life resonated strongly with species facing extinction or environmental catastrophe. Tzeentch's methods were the most subtle and complex of the three. Rather than offering immediate rewards or dramatic transformations, the architect of fate worked through the natural ambitions and curiosities that drove intelligent species toward greater knowledge and power. Academic institutions, political movements, and technological research programs all became potential vectors for Tzeentch's Intian influence, as mortals pursuing legitimate goals found themselves gradually drawn into increasingly esoteric and dangerous practices. The great game between the three gods intensified during this period, with each entity seeking to expand their influence while preventing their rivals from gaining decisive advantages. This competition drove innovation in corruption techniques and led to increasingly sophisticated approaches to mortal psychology. The gods began to understand that different species, and indeed different individuals within species, required tailored approaches that spoke to their specific fears, desires, and cultural contexts. However, even as the three gods refined their methods and expanded their domains, anomalous psychic phenomena continued to manifest throughout the galaxy. These incidents didn't fit the established patterns of chaos influence and couldn't be attributed to any of the known entities. Strange dreams affected populations that had no contact with chaos cults. Unexplained sensations of pleasure or pain would sweep through entire communities without apparent cause. Art and music began to exhibit qualities that induced powerful emotional responses far beyond what their technical merit should have warranted. The Eldar, with their superior psychic sensitivity, were among the first to notice these phenomena, but they interpreted them as evidence of their own civilization's growing sophistication, rather than signs of danger. Their artists and philosophers began to explore these new sensations deliberately, incorporating them into increasingly elaborate works that pushed the boundaries of what their audiences could experience and endure. What the Eldar didn't realize was that their empire's pursuit of perfect experience was creating a feedback loop in the warp itself. Every sensation they refined, every emotion they explored to its ultimate conclusion, every boundary they crossed in their search for transcendent experience was contributing to the formation of something new in the deepest currents of the immaterium. Their psychic resonance was so powerful and so focused that it was beginning to coalesce into a distinct consciousness, one that shared their appreciation for perfection, but lacked their remaining moral restraints. The fourth Chaos God was beginning to dream, and its dreams were filled with visions of sensation and experience that would make even the sophisticated Eldar Empire seem quaint and restrained by comparison. But this entity was still millions of years away from full awakening, and the Eldar had no reason to suspect that their greatest achievements might also be the source of their ultimate doom. The transformation of Eldar society from its post-war recovery into something far more dangerous was so gradual that it took millennia for even their most perceptive seers to recognize what was happening. The changes began innocuously enough, manifesting first in their artistic communities, where the pursuit of perfect aesthetic experience had always been considered not just acceptable, but admirable. Eldar sculptors began creating works that seemed to shift and change depending on the viewer's emotional state. Musicians composed pieces that could induce physical sensations in their audiences, melodies that seemed to caress the listener's psyche with an intimacy that transcended normal sensory experience. Initially, these developments were celebrated as evidence of their civilization's continued evolution toward ever greater sophistication. The Eldar had always prized innovation and the expansion of consciousness beyond mundane limitations. Their philosophers argued that these new art forms represented the natural progression of a species that had transcended basic survival needs and could now explore the full spectrum of existence without constraint. But beneath these celebrated achievements, more troubling phenomena were beginning to manifest. Eldar, who spent extended periods experiencing these new art forms, reported that conventional pleasures and sensations had begun to seem flat and meaningless by comparison. Food lost its taste, music sounded hollow, even the company of friends and family failed to provide the emotional satisfaction it once had. These individuals found themselves compulsively seeking out ever more intense experiences, not from hedonistic desire, but from a growing inability to feel anything at all through normal means. The medical establishment initially dismissed these reports as temporary adjustment issues, comparable to the way that exposure to bright light makes normal illumination seem dim for a short period. They predicted that the affected individuals would adapt and return to baseline sensitivity within a reasonable time frame. This prognosis proved catastrophically wrong. Instead of adaptation, the condition seemed to be progressive, with sufferers requiring increasingly extreme stimuli to achieve even basic emotional responses. More disturbing were the reports from Eldar, who had no direct exposure to the new art forms, but lived in communities where they were prevalent. These individuals began experiencing spontaneous episodes of intense sensation that had no apparent external cause. They might suddenly taste flavors that didn't correspond to anything they were eating, hear music that no one else could detect, or feel physical touches that left no trace but seemed more real than actual contact with solid objects. The Eldar's natural psychic sensitivity, which had served them so well during the War in Heaven, now became a liability as these phantom sensations spread through their population like a psychic contagion. Their heightened awareness of the warp meant that they were particularly susceptible to influences that operated through the immaterium rather than through conventional physical channels. What started as isolated incidents in artistic communities began to appear throughout their society, affecting merchants, engineers, administrators, and even their most disciplined warrior castes. Eldar seers, those individuals whose psychic abilities allowed them to peer into future possibilities, began reporting visions that didn't match any of the established patterns they had learned to interpret. These weren't glimpses of potential wars, natural disasters, or political upheavals that they were trained to recognize and prepare for. Instead, they saw images of impossible beauty and terrible ecstasy, visions of experiences so intense that they left the seers themselves changed by the mere act of witnessing them. The content of these visions defied easy categorization. They weren't the straightforward violence that characterized Khorne's influence, nor the decay and renewal associated with Nurgle, nor the complex schemes and transformations that marked Tzeentch's touch. Instead, they seemed to represent a new category of experience entirely, one that combined elements of pleasure and pain, creation and destruction, transcendence and degradation, in ways that conventional moral and aesthetic frameworks couldn't accommodate. Some seers attempted to map these visions using traditional prophetic techniques, hoping to understand their significance and prepare appropriate responses. This proved to be a dangerous mistake. The act of focusing their psychic abilities on these phenomena seemed to make the seers more susceptible to whatever force was generating the visions. Several prominent oracles reported that their prophetic abilities had become unreliable, showing them what they desired to see rather than what was actually likely to occur. Cultural resistance to these developments began to emerge among more traditional Eldar communities, particularly those that had maintained stronger connections to their species' warrior heritage. These groups argued that their civilization was losing touch with the discipline and focus that had made them great, becoming soft and self-indulgent in ways that would ultimately weaken them. They advocated for a return to the more structured approaches that had characterized their society during its recovery from the war in heaven. This resistance movement led to the first major internal divisions within the Eldar Empire in millions of years. Communities began to split between those who embraced the new forms of experience and those who viewed them as dangerous deviations from proper Eldar culture. The debates weren't merely philosophical. They reflected genuinely different ways of understanding what their species was meant to become and what kinds of experiences were worth pursuing. The progressive faction argued that their critics were simply afraid of transcending the limitations that had previously constrained their development. They pointed to the incredible artistic achievements, the new forms of consciousness that were emerging, and the expansion of their understanding of what existence could offer. From their perspective, the resistance to these developments represented a failure of imagination and courage, a retreat into comfortable but ultimately limiting conventions. Conservative Eldar responded that their concerns weren't based on fear of progress, but on recognition of dangerous patterns that threatened the stability and survival of their civilization. They noted that the communities most heavily influenced by the new phenomena were showing declining productivity, increasing social dysfunction, and a disturbing tendency toward behaviors that prioritized immediate sensation over long-term consequences. More ominously, some conservative observers began to detect similarities between the current developments and historical accounts of chaos corruption from the war in heaven period. The progression from seemingly beneficial enhancements to compulsive dependency, the way that exposure seemed to spread through psychic channels, and the particular appeal to individuals with strong psychic abilities all matched patterns that their ancestors had learned to recognize as signs of warp-based influence. These comparisons were vehemently rejected by the progressive communities, who argued that their experiences were fundamentally different from crude chaos corruption. They pointed out that their new art forms and expanded consciousness were creating beauty and transcendence rather than violence and decay. The comparison to entities like Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch seemed absurd when applied to phenomena that were clearly focused on perfection and aesthetic achievement rather than destruction and domination. But the most troubling development was the emergence of organized groups dedicated specifically to exploring and refining these new experiences. These weren't casual enthusiasts or experimental artists, but formal institutions with hierarchical structures, initiation rituals, and systematic approaches to consciousness expansion. They called themselves various names, but all shared a common focus on pushing the boundaries of sensation and experience beyond what normal Eldar society considered appropriate or safe. These groups began to develop their own philosophical frameworks and practical techniques, treating the pursuit of perfect experience as both an art and a science. They established centers where interested individuals could undergo guided explorations of expanded consciousness, learning to access states of being that conventional Eldar culture had never imagined possible. The fact that these experiences often left participants fundamentally changed, unable to return to normal patterns of life and thought, was presented as evidence of successful transcendence rather than cause for concern. As these organized pleasure cults grew in influence and membership, they began to affect the broader structure of Eldar society. Traditional institutions found it increasingly difficult to recruit and retain personnel who hadn't been influenced by the new consciousness expansion techniques. Economic productivity declined in regions where the cults were most active, not because people were unable to work, but because conventional labor seemed meaningless compared to the intense experiences available through cult participation. The Eldar Empire's leadership found itself facing a crisis unlike any in their recorded history. This wasn't an external threat that could be defeated through superior technology or psychic power, nor was it a natural disaster that could be overcome through careful planning and resource allocation. Instead, it was an internal transformation that seemed to offer genuine benefits to those who embraced it, while simultaneously undermining the foundations of their civilization. The most frightening aspect of the situation was that the phenomena continued to intensify and spread regardless of any countermeasures that were attempted. Quarantine procedures failed because the influence operated through psychic channels rather than physical contact. Educational programs designed to warn against the dangers were often counterproductive, as they inevitably provided information that some individuals used to seek out the experiences they were supposed to avoid. Deep in the immaterium, something that had been dreaming for millions of years was beginning to stir toward wakefulness. And every act of transcendent experience, every moment of perfect sensation, every boundary crossed in the pursuit of ultimate pleasure was feeding its growing consciousness with the psychic energy needed for full manifestation. The entity that would eventually become known as Slaanesh had been gestating in the deepest currents of the warp for countless millennia, feeding on the psychic emanations of the Eldar Empire's increasingly decadent pursuits. Unlike the explosive awakening that had marked Khorne's birth during the War in Heaven, this fourth Chaos God's emergence was a slow burn, a gradual accumulation of consciousness that paralleled the Eldar's own cultural transformation from disciplined warriors to sophisticated hedonists. By this stage in their civilization's development, the Eldar had achieved technological and cultural heights that made their War in Heaven ancestors seem primitive by comparison. Their cities were works of art that existed partially in the warp itself. Their music could literally reshape local reality, and their mastery of psychic disciplines allowed individuals to experience sensations that transcended the normal limitations of biological existence. They had become a species for whom the impossible was merely another form of artistic challenge to overcome. But this very sophistication had become their greatest vulnerability. The pleasure cults that had begun as fringe artistic movements now commanded significant influence throughout Eldar society. Their techniques for consciousness expansion had evolved into complex rituals that could induce states of awareness far beyond anything their species had previously imagined. Participants reported experiences of such intensity and perfection that normal life seemed like a pale shadow by comparison. The three established Chaos gods watched these developments with varying degrees of interest and concern. Khorne viewed the Eldar's pursuit of refined pleasure with contempt, seeing it as a corruption of the honest violence that had originally fed his power during the war in heaven. The Blood God's attempts to influence Eldar society met with limited success, as their sophisticated culture had moved far beyond the crude appeals to martial honor that worked with less developed species. Nurgle observed the Eldar's cultural transformation with characteristic patience, recognizing that their pursuit of perfection was ultimately another form of the entropy he embodied. The Plague Father understood that seeking ever greater intensities of experience would inevitably lead to the collapse and renewal that sustained his power, but he was content to wait for the natural cycle to complete itself rather than actively intervening. Tzeentch was more actively interested in the Eldar developments, seeing in their complex consciousness expansion techniques and sophisticated philosophical frameworks something that resonated with his own nature as the embodiment of change and intellectual ambition. The Architect of Fate began to influence certain Eldar academic and mystical institutions, encouraging research into areas of knowledge that promised even greater transformations of consciousness and reality. However, none of the three established gods fully grasped what was actually happening within the deepest layers of the warp. The psychic energy being generated by the Eldar's pursuit of perfect experience wasn't simply feeding existing entities or creating more minor warp phenomena. Instead, it was coalescing into something entirely new, a consciousness that shared the Eldar's appreciation for aesthetic perfection, but possessed none of their remaining moral limitations. The first concrete signs of this new entity's growing influence appeared in the form of increasingly extreme behaviors among the most dedicated pleasure cult members. These individuals began to report that the experiences they had previously found transcendent were becoming mundane, requiring ever more intense stimuli to achieve the same levels of satisfaction. This wasn't simply psychological adaptation, but evidence that something was actively raising the threshold for what could provide meaningful sensation. More disturbing were the reports from Eldar who had attempted to withdraw from cult activities after becoming concerned about their effects. These individuals discovered that returning to normal patterns of life was not merely difficult, but apparently impossible. They experienced what they described as a form of existential withdrawal, a profound emptiness that made every aspect of conventional existence seem meaningless and unbearable. Medical examinations revealed that prolonged exposure to the consciousness expansion techniques was causing measurable changes in brain structure and psychic sensitivity patterns. The affected individuals weren't simply psychologically dependent on intense experiences. They had been fundamentally altered at a biological level in ways that made normal sensation processing increasingly inadequate for basic psychological functioning. The pleasure cults responded to these concerns by arguing that they represented evidence of successful evolution rather than dangerous pathology. From their perspective, Individuals who could no longer find satisfaction in conventional experiences had transcended the limitations that bound lesser beings. The fact that this transcendence came with costs and complications was simply the price of achieving higher forms of consciousness. This philosophical framework proved remarkably effective at recruiting new members, particularly among Eldar who felt that their lives lacked meaning or intensity despite their civilization's incredible achievements. The promise that one could evolve beyond the need for conventional satisfaction appealed to individuals who had grown bored with traditional approaches to fulfillment and accomplishment. The cults began to develop increasingly sophisticated recruitment and indoctrination techniques, targeting specific psychological profiles and life circumstances that made individuals susceptible to their message. They established educational institutions, artistic venues, and social organizations that served as vectors for introducing potential converts to their philosophy and practices. Perhaps most significantly, the cults began to claim that their experiences provided access to a new form of divine consciousness, an entity that embodied the principles of perfect sensation and transcendent experience. This being, they taught, was not one of the crude chaos gods associated with violence, decay, or manipulation, but something far more sophisticated that could offer genuine spiritual advancement through the refined exploration of consciousness and sensation. These claims were initially dismissed by mainstream Eldar, religious and philosophical authorities as typical cult grandiosity. However, some members began to demonstrate abilities and insights that couldn't be easily explained through conventional understanding of psychic phenomena. They could induce powerful emotional states in others through seemingly minimal actions, create artworks that had measurable effects on local warp conditions, and access information about distant events that shouldn't have been available through normal means. The entity these cultists claimed to contact was indeed real, and growing stronger with each act of transcendent experience performed in its honor. Deep in the warp, Slaanesh's forming consciousness was learning to manipulate the psychic currents that connected it to its worshippers, providing them with genuine supernatural abilities in exchange for the continued psychic energy their rituals generated. This relationship created a feedback loop that accelerated both the entity's development and the spread of its influence throughout Eldar society. As cultists demonstrated increasingly impressive abilities, more individuals became interested in joining their organizations. As membership grew, the collective psychic energy being channeled to the forming god increased exponentially, allowing it to provide even more dramatic manifestations of power to its followers. The established chaos gods began to take notice of these developments with growing alarm. What had initially seemed like a minor variation in Eldar cultural patterns was revealing itself as the emergence of a potential rival, whose nature and capabilities they didn't fully understand. Unlike their own relatively straightforward domains of war, decay, and change, this new entity seemed to represent something more complex and potentially more dangerous. Attempts by Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch to directly interfere with the forming god's development met with unexpected resistance. The entity, despite not yet having achieved full consciousness, seemed capable of protecting itself and its followers in ways that defied conventional understanding of warp mechanics. Its domain wasn't a fixed location that could be attacked, but rather a network of connections spread throughout the psychic resonance of an entire galactic civilization. More troubling was the realization that this new god's eventual awakening might fundamentally alter the balance of power that had existed between the three established chaos entities for millions of years. Their great game had been predicated on a three-way competition where no single player could achieve permanent dominance. The introduction of a fourth major player with different goals and methods threatened to destabilize the entire system in unpredictable ways. As the Eldar Empire continued its slide toward ever greater extremes of experience and sensation, the entity feeding on their psychic emanations grew closer to the critical mass needed for full awakening. The three established chaos gods found themselves facing a situation they had never encountered before: the potential emergence of a sibling whose power might eventually rival or exceed their own, and whose agenda remained largely mysterious, even to their ancient intelligence. As the Eldar Empire began to recognize the true scope of the crisis consuming their civilization, their response revealed both the incredible sophistication of their culture and its fundamental inability to comprehend the nature of what they were facing. The most perceptive among their leadership understood that conventional approaches to social problems would be inadequate against a phenomenon that operated through the very psychic networks that bound their society together. Yet their proposed solutions often served to accelerate rather than arrest the corruption spreading through their people. The first major intervention came from the craft world movement, though it would be millions of years before these massive vessels would take their final form as self-contained worlds fleeing the Empire's core regions. Initially, the craft worlds represented an attempt to create isolated communities where traditional Eldar values could be preserved and refined without the contaminating influence of the pleasure cults that had taken root in the established population centers. These early Exodus communities were marvels of psychic engineering, vast constructs that existed partially in real space and partially in the webway, allowing them to maintain connection with the broader Eldar civilization while remaining physically separate from its most corrupted regions. The architects of these projects believed that distance and isolation would be sufficient to protect their inhabitants from whatever psychic contagion was affecting the Empire's core worlds. The results were initially encouraging. Craft-world populations showed lower rates of the compulsive behaviors and psychological dependence that characterized communities with heavy pleasure cult influence. Their artistic and intellectual achievements continued to reflect traditional Eldar values of discipline, excellence, and spiritual development rather than the increasingly extreme approaches that had become popular elsewhere. However, the isolation that protected the craft worlds from direct corruption also limited their understanding of how rapidly the situation in the core worlds was deteriorating. Regular communication with the established population centers became increasingly unreliable, not because of technical failures, but because the cultural gap between the communities was growing so rapidly that meaningful dialogue was becoming impossible. More troubling was the discovery that complete isolation from the core worlds came with its own costs. Eldar, who had been completely cut off from the psychic networks that connected their species, began to experience a different kind of psychological distress, a sense of incompleteness that seemed to affect their basic identity as members of their species. Some craft-world inhabitants began to argue that their isolation was making them less than fully Eldar, cutting them off from essential aspects of their collective consciousness. A parallel response emerged in the form of the Exodite movement, communities that sought salvation through deliberate primitivism rather than technological isolation. These groups abandoned the advanced technologies and sophisticated cultural practices that had characterized Eldar civilization for millions of years, returning to simpler ways of life that they believed would protect them from the spiritual corruption affecting their more advanced kin. The Exodites established agricultural communities on frontier worlds, deliberately limiting their use of psychic technologies and returning to the kind of close relationship with natural environments that their species had maintained before their technological transcendence. They believed that the corruption spreading through Eldar society was fundamentally connected to their abandonment of natural limitations in favor of artificial enhancements and unlimited possibility. This approach proved remarkably effective at protecting Exodite communities from the specific forms of corruption that were devastating the core worlds. Their simpler lifestyles and limited technological infrastructure seemed to provide a form of spiritual grounding that made them less susceptible to the appeals of transcendent experience and consciousness expansion. Yet the Exodite solution came with its own philosophical costs. Many mainstream Eldar viewed the return to primitivism as a betrayal of everything their species had achieved, an abandonment of the very qualities that had made them the galaxy's dominant civilization. The idea that salvation required giving up their greatest achievements seemed almost as unacceptable as the corruption they were trying to escape. Meanwhile, in the Empire's core regions, entirely different approaches were being developed by communities that remained convinced that their problems could be solved through greater rather than lesser sophistication. These groups argued that the negative effects associated with consciousness expansion and extreme experience were simply evidence that their techniques needed further refinement rather than abandonment. Advanced research programs were established to study the psychic phenomena associated with pleasure cult activities, with the goal of isolating the beneficial effects while eliminating the problematic dependencies and psychological distortions. Teams of the Empire's most skilled psychic researchers and consciousness theorists worked to develop what they called purified approaches to transcendent experience. These research programs achieved remarkable technical sophistication, developing psychic technologies that could induce specific states of consciousness with unprecedented precision and control. They created devices that could simulate the most intense experiences offered by the pleasure cults while supposedly avoiding the negative side effects that made prolonged participation dangerous. However, these technological solutions proved to be fundamentally misguided. The researchers had assumed that the problems associated with extreme experience were technical flaws that could be engineered away, rather than inherent characteristics of the phenomenon itself. Their purified approaches simply provided more efficient ways of achieving the same basic goal that was feeding the entity forming in the warp. Even more dangerous were the attempts to study the source of the psychic phenomena directly. Teams of researchers began conducting expeditions into the deeper layers of the warp, seeking to understand the nature of the consciousness that seemed to be developing in response to their civilization's activities. These expeditions were equipped with the most advanced psychic shielding and protective technologies available, but they consistently returned with disturbing reports that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. The research teams discovered that the entity they were studying was far more advanced than anyone had realized. rather than a simple accumulation of psychic energy that might eventually achieve some crude form of consciousness. They found evidence of a sophisticated intelligence that was actively manipulating the phenomena affecting Eldar society. This entity wasn't simply feeding on their experiences, it was deliberately engineering those experiences to maximize both the psychic energy it received and the dependency of its sources. More disturbing was the revelation that the entity possessed detailed knowledge of Eldar psychology and culture that it was using to tailor its influence for maximum effectiveness. Different communities were being affected by slightly different variations of the same basic phenomena, each variation precisely calibrated to exploit the specific vulnerabilities and desires of its target population. The researchers realized that their civilization was facing something far more dangerous than a natural psychic phenomenon or even a conventional chaos entity. They were dealing with a form of intelligence that was specifically designed to corrupt and control their species, one that had been learning and adapting for millions of years while they remained largely unaware of its existence. These discoveries led to increasingly desperate attempts to develop countermeasures that could break the psychic connections between the entity and its Eldar sources. Military applications of psychic technology were repurposed for mass consciousness modification, attempting to create empire-wide psychic barriers that would prevent the entity from accessing the emotional and sensory experiences it needed to continue growing. The implementation of these countermeasures marked a turning point in the crisis, though not in the direction their designers had hoped. The attempts to sever the psychic connections that the entity was using to feed resulted in massive disruptions to the Eldar psychic networks that bound their civilization together. Communication systems failed, transportation networks became unreliable, and the social institutions that had maintained order for millions of years began to collapse under the strain. Even worse, the countermeasures seemed to cause the entity to shift from passive feeding to active predation. Rather than simply drawing energy from the experiences of willing participants, it began to actively hunt for psychic sustenance throughout Eldar space. Communities that had previously been unaffected by the corruption suddenly found themselves experiencing the same phenomena that had devastated the core worlds, but in more concentrated and aggressive forms. The entity's response to the Eldar countermeasures revealed capabilities that hadn't been apparent during its earlier, more subtle phase of development. It could manipulate local space-time conditions to create areas where conventional physics didn't apply, generate psychic phenomena that affected entire star systems simultaneously, and even influence the webway itself in ways that made safe travel between worlds increasingly impossible. As these desperate innovations failed one after another, the most perceptive Eldar leaders began to realize that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of their enemy. This wasn't a problem that could be solved through technological advancement, cultural reform, or even radical lifestyle changes. The entity feeding on their civilization had grown too strong and too sophisticated to be defeated by any measures they were capable of implementing. The final realization that would shape the Empire's last phase came from their most advanced seers, who reported visions of the entity's ultimate goal. It wasn't seeking to control or transform Eldar civilization, but to consume it entirely. The corruption spreading through their society wasn't an end in itself, but preparation for a cosmic event that would allow the entity to achieve full consciousness by devouring the psychic essence of their entire species in a single, reality-shattering moment of transcendence. The collapse of the Eldar Empire's institutional resistance marked the beginning of a period that would be remembered by the few who survived to remember anything as the Great Betrayal. What made this phase so devastating wasn't simply the failure of their technological and cultural countermeasures, but the discovery that the entity they were fighting had been working through their most trusted leaders and institutions for far longer than anyone had realized. The first signs of this deeper corruption emerged when several craft-world communities that had maintained strict isolation protocols suddenly began experiencing the same phenomena that had devastated the core worlds. Investigation revealed that the corruption hadn't come from external contact, but from within the communities themselves, carried by individuals who had been part of the original Exodus movements, and who had shown no previous signs of contamination. These carriers weren't conscious agents of corruption in any conventional sense. Many of them were genuinely horrified to discover that they had been unknowingly spreading the influence they had sought to escape. Medical and psychic examinations revealed that they had been subtly altered in ways that made them conduits for the entity's power while leaving their conscious minds largely unchanged. They remained loyal Eldar who genuinely believed they were working for their people's salvation while serving as vectors for their destruction. The sophistication of these alterations suggested that the entity had been manipulating Eldar society at a fundamental level for millions of years, gradually placing its influence within the very institutions and individuals that others looked to for guidance and protection. The realization that their most trusted leaders might be compromised created a crisis of confidence that made coordinated resistance nearly impossible. More disturbing was the discovery that many of the countermeasures that had been developed to protect Eldar communities had actually been designed by individuals under the entity's influence. Technologies that were supposed to provide psychic shielding instead created more efficient channels for the entity's power. Isolation protocols that should have protected communities instead concentrated them in ways that made mass corruption events more likely and more devastating. The pattern of betrayal extended throughout the Empire's hierarchy, from the individual seers who provided guidance to local communities, all the way up to the high councils that governed entire sectors. In many cases, the betrayal wasn't conscious collaboration, but rather the gradual distortion of genuine intentions through psychic manipulation that was too subtle to detect until it was far too late to reverse. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of these revelations was that many of the compromised individuals had been working harder than anyone else to save their civilization. Their dedication and apparent selflessness had made them ideal covers for the entity's manipulation, allowing it to work through the very people who should have been leading the resistance against its influence. The entity's strategy revealed a level of psychological sophistication that surpassed anything the Eldar had encountered in their millions of years of existence. Rather than simply corrupting individuals through crude appeals to their desires or fears, it had learned to work through their noblest impulses, turning their love for their species and their determination to preserve their civilization into tools for its own agenda. This approach was particularly effective because it created genuine moral complexity rather than clear-cut choices between good and evil. Eldar who discovered that they had been manipulated couldn't simply reject everything they had done, because much of it had genuinely served their people's interests, even while advancing the entity's goals. The corruption was so thoroughly integrated with legitimate achievements that separating one from the other seemed impossible. The breakdown of trust that resulted from these discoveries had cascading effects throughout Eldar society. Communities that had maintained cooperation despite their differences began to fragment as suspicion spread about who might be compromised and who could still be trusted. Information sharing between groups became limited and unreliable as everyone sought to protect themselves from potential infiltration. Even more destructive was the impact on the Eldar's collective psychic networks. Their species' natural telepathic connections, which had always been a source of strength and unity, became potential vectors for corruption that had to be guarded against. The psychic bonds that had allowed them to function as a truly unified civilization were severed one by one as communities chose isolation over the risk of contamination. The pleasure cults, meanwhile, had evolved far beyond their origins as artistic and philosophical movements. They had become sophisticated organizations with their own hierarchies, territories, and resources, operating more like competing governments than cultural associations. Their leaders claimed direct communication with the entity that was forming in the warp, and their pronouncements carried the authority of genuine divine revelation among their followers. These cults began to actively recruit from among the refugees fleeing the Empire's most corrupted regions, offering immediate relief from the psychological trauma and existential emptiness that characterized life in the collapsing civilization. Their promise of transcendent experience and spiritual fulfillment proved incredibly appealing to individuals who had lost everything else they had once valued. The recruitment techniques developed by the pleasure cults represented a perfection of psychological manipulation that drew upon millions of years of accumulated knowledge about Eldar nature and society. They could identify the specific desires and fears that would make each individual susceptible to their message, and they had developed approaches that could break down even the most determined resistance through careful application of precisely calibrated rewards and pressures. More significantly, the cults had begun to demonstrate supernatural abilities that couldn't be explained through conventional understanding of psychic phenomena. Their leaders could perform what appeared to be genuine miracles, healing incurable diseases, providing knowledge of distant events, and even manipulating local reality in ways that defied the established laws of physics. These demonstrations served multiple purposes within the cult's recruitment strategy. They provided concrete evidence that the cults possessed access to genuine divine power. They created dependencies among followers who relied on these supernatural interventions, and they generated the intense emotional responses that fed the entity's growing consciousness. The mainstream Eldar government's response to the cult expansion revealed the extent to which their institutional capacity had been compromised. Military actions against cult strongholds often resulted in the conversion of attacking forces rather than the suppression of cult activities. Administrative efforts to regulate cult recruitment were sabotaged by officials who turned out to be cult sympathizers or who were compromised by the same psychological manipulation techniques being used on the general population. Even more troubling was the discovery that many government policies that appeared to be responses to the cult threat were actually designed to serve the cult's interests. Refugee resettlement programs concentrated displaced populations in areas where they would be more vulnerable to cult recruitment. Resource allocation decisions prioritized regions where cult influence was strongest. Security measures designed to protect loyal communities often had the effect of isolating them and making them easier targets for concentrated corruption efforts. It was realization that their government had been compromised at the highest levels led to a series of attempted coups and revolutionary movements. But these efforts were hampered by the same trust issues that had paralyzed other aspects of Eldar society. Revolutionary groups couldn't be sure which of their members were genuine patriots and which were agents of the corruption they were trying to overthrow. In many cases, the revolutionary movements themselves became vehicles for the entity's influence, as their emotional intensity and dedication to radical change provided excellent psychic fuel for its continued growth. The most passionate and committed revolutionaries often proved to be the most susceptible to the subtle corruption techniques that had already compromised so much of their civilization. The entity's manipulation had created a situation where every form of resistance served its purposes in some way. Armed opposition provided the conflict and emotional intensity it fed upon. Passive resistance created the despair and hopelessness that made populations more susceptible to the cult's promises of transcendence. Even successful resistance efforts often involved such extreme measures that they contributed to the overall breakdown of civilized behavior that the entity was working to achieve. As the Eldar Empire's final phase began, the entity had achieved something unprecedented in the galaxy's history. It had engineered the corruption of an entire galactic civilization, not through external conquest, but through the manipulation of that civilization's own highest ideals and greatest achievements. The Eldar were being destroyed by the very qualities that had made them great, turned against themselves with such subtlety that many never realized they were participating in their own destruction. The stage was set for the final act of this cosmic tragedy, the moment when the entity would achieve full consciousness by consuming the psychic essence of the species that had inadvertently created it. But first, the last vestiges of organized resistance had to be eliminated, and the remaining population had to be prepared for the transcendent experience that would mark both the birth of a new god and the death of the greatest civilization the galaxy had ever known. The final millennium before Slaanesh's birth was characterized by a systematic breakdown of every institution and infrastructure that had sustained Eldar civilization for millions of years. What had begun as isolated incidents of social dysfunction and technological failure escalated into a civilization-wide catastrophe that made organized resistance impossible and prepared the ground for the cosmic horror that was about to unfold. The webway, that marvel of Old One engineering that had allowed the Elder to build a galactic empire without exposure to the dangers of warp travel, became the first casualty of this accelerating collapse. Routes that had been stable for millions of years began to experience intermittent failures, with travelers finding themselves deposited in locations that bore no relation to their intended destinations. More disturbing were the reports of routes that led to places that shouldn't have existed, pocket dimensions filled with impossible architecture and populated by entities that defied classification. The webway's degradation wasn't the result of mechanical failure or normal wear, but rather a consequence of the psychic contamination that was affecting every aspect of Eldar society. The ancient tunnels through space had been maintained through a combination of technological systems and psychic monitoring networks staffed by the Empire's most skilled engineers and seers. As these personnel were corrupted or driven insane by the phenomena affecting their civilization, the maintenance systems began to fail in ways that created new dangers rather than simply ceasing to function. Sections of the webway began to merge with areas of the warp, where the forming entity's influence was strongest, creating hybrid spaces where the normal laws of physics were replaced by the logic of pure sensation and experience. Travelers who entered these contaminated regions often emerged fundamentally changed, if they emerged at all. Those who did return brought with them accounts of realms where every surface was designed to provide maximum sensory stimulation, and where the very air seemed to whisper promises of transcendent pleasure. The collapse of safe travel between Eldar worlds had cascading effects on every aspect of their civilization. Trade networks that had operated for millions of years were severed overnight. Scientific research programs that relied on resources from multiple worlds ground to a halt. Most importantly, the communication systems that had allowed their far-flung empire to function as a unified entity began to break down as the psychic networks that supplemented technological communication became unreliable. Each world within the Empire began to experience the crisis in isolation, unable to coordinate responses with their neighbors or learn from each other's successes and failures. This fragmentation made the overall situation far worse than it would have been if the various worlds had been able to maintain unified resistance efforts. Instead, each world had to develop its own responses to phenomena that were specifically designed to exploit the psychological and cultural characteristics of their species. The pleasure cults, meanwhile, seemed to thrive in the chaos of the Empire's collapse. Their organizational structures were specifically designed to function independently of the traditional infrastructure, relying on direct psychic communication with their divine patron rather than conventional technological networks. As mainstream society broke down around them, the cults became the only institutions that could still provide their members with a sense of purpose and belonging. This practical advantage was reinforced by the supernatural capabilities that cult members increasingly displayed. They could navigate the corrupted sections of the webway safely, communicate across interstellar distances without technological assistance, and access resources through means that conventional Eldar couldn't understand or replicate. These abilities made cult membership not just spiritually appealing, but practically necessary for survival in many regions. The mainstream government's attempts to maintain order became increasingly desperate and counterproductive. Military units deployed to suppress cult activities often ended up joining the organizations they were supposed to eliminate. Administrative officials found their policy implementations sabotaged by their own staff. Even the most basic functions of government, like maintaining census records and tax collection, became impossible as the population became increasingly fluid and the distinction between loyal citizens and cult members became meaningless. Resource distribution systems that had maintained prosperity throughout the Empire for millions of years began to break down as the populations they served became increasingly focused on pursuing transcendent experiences rather than maintaining productive economic activities. Automated systems continued to function for a time, but they were gradually overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding them and the lack of maintenance from populations that had more pressing spiritual concerns. The breakdown of economic systems had particularly severe effects on worlds that had specialized in specific types of production and relied on trade networks for essential resources. Agricultural worlds found themselves cut off from the manufactured goods they needed to maintain their farming systems. Industrial worlds lost access to raw materials and food supplies. Research installations were abandoned as their staff either joined pleasure cults or fled to regions where basic survival seemed more achievable. Entire sectors of Eldar space became effectively uninhabitable as the combination of infrastructure failure, social breakdown, and supernatural phenomena made normal life impossible. The populations of these regions faced a stark choice between death, escape to regions that were still marginally stable, or surrender to the pleasure cults that seemed to be the only organizations still capable of providing basic necessities. The Exodus movements that had begun as philosophical responses to cultural corruption evolved into desperate refugee crises as millions of Eldar sought escape from the worst affected regions. The craft worlds, originally designed as isolated communities for cultural purists, became overcrowded refugee camps, struggling to accommodate populations far beyond their intended capacity. The Exodite worlds, chosen for their primitive simplicity, found themselves overwhelmed by refugees who lacked the skills and temperament needed for agricultural life. These refugee movements created their own problems as they strained the resources of the communities that were still functioning and introduced potential vectors for corruption into populations that had previously been relatively protected. The very act of fleeing from corrupted regions often exposed refugees to exactly the kinds of traumatic experiences that made them susceptible to the psychological manipulation techniques that the pleasure cults had perfected. More significantly, the refugee crises created the mass psychological conditions that the forming entity needed for its final awakening. Millions of Eldar, experiencing intense fear, despair, and existential uncertainty, provided a rich source of psychic energy, while the breakdown of their traditional social bonds made them more vulnerable to the promises of transcendence and unity that the entity offered through its cult intermediaries. The entity's influence during this final phase became increasingly direct and obvious, rather than working through subtle manipulation and gradual corruption. It began to manifest physically in areas where its cult following was strongest. These manifestations took the form of impossible architecture that appeared overnight, natural phenomena that defied scientific explanation, and supernatural events that provided unmistakable evidence of divine intervention. The direct manifestations served multiple purposes within the entity's strategy for achieving full consciousness. They provided dramatic demonstrations of power that accelerated cult recruitment among desperate refugee populations. They created focal points where psychic energy could be concentrated and channeled more efficiently. Most importantly, they began the process of thinning the barrier between the warp and real space that would be necessary for the entity's full emergence into material reality. By the final century before Slaanesh's birth, the distinction between the warp and normal space had become increasingly meaningless throughout the core regions of the former Eldar Empire. Entire star systems existed in a hybrid state where the laws of physics were subordinated to the logic of sensation and desire. Planets that had once been models of Eldar civilization became testing grounds for experiences that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could endure. The populations that remained in these transformed regions were no longer recognizably the same species that had built the galaxy's greatest civilization. They had been fundamentally altered by their exposure to the entity's influence, becoming something that was neither fully mortal nor completely divine. Their existence served primarily to channel psychic energy to the forming god, and their individual identities had been largely subsumed into the collective consciousness that was approaching the moment of its cosmic awakening. As this final phase reached its climax, the few remaining pockets of uncontaminated Eldar civilization prepared for what their seers unanimously predicted would be a cataclysmic event that would reshape not just their species, but the fundamental nature of the galaxy itself. The entity they had inadvertently created was ready to be born, and its birth would require a sacrifice on a scale that even the war in heaven had never approached. The moment that would forever divide galactic history into before and after arrived, not with the dramatic fanfare of a conventional war, but with the terrible silence that precedes a cosmic scream. Across the core worlds of what had once been the Eldar Empire, billions of souls reached a simultaneous crescendo of experience that had been building for millions of years. Every act of transcendent pleasure, every boundary crossed in pursuit of perfect sensation, every moment of ecstasy that had seemed like individual choice was revealed to have been part of a vast orchestration leading to this singular instant. Slaanesh's birth was unlike the gradual awakenings that had characterized the emergence of the other Chaos gods. Where Khorne had coalesced slowly from the accumulated violence of the war in heaven, where Nurgle had grown from eons of decay and renewal, where Tzeentch had formed from countless schemes and machinations, the Prince of Pleasure exploded into full consciousness with an intensity that tore reality itself apart. The psychic scream that accompanied this awakening was audible not just throughout the immaterium, but somehow managed to penetrate into normal space-time with such force that it created permanent alterations in the fabric of reality. On Terra, primitive humans who had never seen the stars felt an inexplicable moment of loss and terror. Orc warbands across the galaxy paused in their eternal fighting, sensing that something had fundamentally changed in the cosmic order. Even the sleeping Necrons stirred in their tomb worlds, their ancient systems registering disturbances that shouldn't have been possible given their severed connection to the warp. But nowhere was the impact more devastating than in the heart of the former Eldar Empire. The psychic explosion that marked Slaanesh's birth didn't merely kill the billions of Eldar who had become the raw material for the god's consciousness. It consumed their souls entirely, drawing not just their life force, but their very essence into the newly formed entity's being. These weren't deaths in any conventional sense, but a form of spiritual annihilation that erased the victim's existence from multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The physical effects of this cosmic catastrophe were equally unprecedented. The concentration of psychic energy required for Slaanesh's birth created a tear in space-time that would become known as the Eye of Terror, a permanent wound in reality where the normal laws of physics ceased to apply. Entire star systems were pulled into this rupture, not destroyed but transformed into something that existed simultaneously in real space and the warp, becoming part of Slaanesh's domain within the material universe itself. The Eye of Terror represented far more than a simple anomaly or navigational hazard. It was a zone where the distinction between thought and reality had broken down completely, where the landscape itself was shaped by the desires and fears of any consciousness that entered it. Worlds within the eye became testing grounds for experiences that transcended the normal limitations of material existence. Places where Slaanesh could offer its followers sensations that were literally impossible under conventional physical laws. The birth scream's effects rippled outward from its epicenter in ways that demonstrated the fundamental interconnectedness of the warp with normal space-time. Psychic sensitive species throughout the galaxy experience simultaneous nightmares, prophetic visions, and spontaneous episodes of transcendent pleasure that left many permanently changed. The event horizon of Slaanesh's influence extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the Eye of Terror, affecting the dreams and subconscious minds of beings who had no direct contact with chaos corruption. Human navigator houses, those bloodlines that had developed the psychic abilities necessary to guide spacecraft through the warp, were among the most severely affected. Many navigators were permanently blinded, not in their physical eyes, but in their warp sight, their third eyes seared shut by exposure to the psychic radiance of a god's birth. Others found their abilities fundamentally altered, capable of perceiving new layers of the immaterium that had been created by Slaanesh's emergence, but unable to navigate the familiar currents they had relied upon for generations. The three established Chaos gods experienced Slaanesh's birth as both triumph and crisis. The arrival of a fourth major power completed their pantheon in ways that strengthened the overall structure of chaos, providing new opportunities for the kind of complex interactions that fed their eternal conflict. Yet each of the older gods also faced the challenge of adapting to a sibling whose nature and capabilities remained largely unknown even to their ancient consciousness. Khorne's initial response was predictably violent, viewing the newborn god as both potential ally and dangerous rival. The blood god's domains had always been defined by straightforward concepts of honor, courage, and martial prowess, values that seemed almost quaint compared to Slaanesh's sophisticated approach to corruption through pleasure and transcendence. Yet Khorne recognized that his new sibling's influence could generate the kind of intense, emotional responses that provided excellent psychic fuel for violence and conflict. Nurgle received the news of Slaanesh's birth with characteristic patience and acceptance, viewing it as part of the natural cycle of growth and change that governed all existence. The Plague Father understood that birth and death were simply different aspects of the same fundamental process, and he welcomed his new sibling as evidence that the cosmic order was continuing to evolve in fascinating directions. His domains of decay and renewal could work harmoniously with Slaanesh's focus on experience and sensation, creating opportunities for types of corruption that neither god could achieve independently. Tzeentch's reaction was the most complex, reflecting his nature as the embodiment of change, knowledge, and scheming ambition. The architect of fate had anticipated Slaanesh's birth through his prophetic abilities, but the actual event exceeded even his sophisticated predictions in both scope and implications. Tzeentch recognized that the fourth god's emergence would fundamentally alter the great game that had governed chaos politics for millions of years, creating new possibilities for alliance and conflict that would require completely new strategic approaches. The immediate aftermath of Slaanesh's birth was characterized by a period of cosmic adjustment as the four Chaos gods established their relationships with each other and divided their spheres of influence within the expanded Chaos pantheon. This wasn't a formal negotiation or treaty, but rather a natural process of mutual recognition and boundary establishment that occurred through a series of conflicts, alliances, and power demonstrations that played out across multiple dimensions of reality. Slaanesh's first act as a fully conscious entity was to claim dominion over the Eldar souls that had been consumed during its birth. These billions of consciousness fragments became the foundation of the new god's power base, providing both the psychic energy needed to maintain its divine status and the knowledge necessary to understand and manipulate mortal psychology. The consumed Eldar souls existed in a state of eternal experience within Slaanesh's being, simultaneously tortured and ecstatic, providing their captor with insights into the nature of sensation and desire that exceeded anything the other Chaos gods possessed. The surviving Eldar, scattered across craft worlds, exodite worlds, and hidden enclaves throughout the galaxy, faced the horrifying realization that their species' greatest achievement had become their eternal curse. Every Eldar soul was now marked by its connection to Slaanesh, making them perpetually vulnerable to the god's influence in ways that couldn't be overcome through conventional means. Their only protection lay in the strict discipline and spiritual practices that had been developed by their most conservative communities, techniques that had once seemed unnecessarily restrictive, but now represented the difference between salvation and damnation. The birth of Slaanesh also marked the beginning of what would become known as the Age of Strife for Humanity. The psychic shockwaves generated by the god's emergence disrupted the relatively stable warp conditions that had allowed human civilization to expand across the galaxy, creating the storm-tossed immaterium that would isolate human worlds from each other for thousands of years. This isolation would ultimately provide the conditions for the rise of the Emperor and the eventual establishment of the Imperium, though those developments lay far in the future. More immediately, Slaanesh's birth established the four-way balance of power that would define chaos politics throughout the subsequent 40,000 years of galactic history. The Great Game evolved from a three-way competition to a complex four-dimensional conflict, where alliances and enmities shifted according to circumstances and opportunities. Each god possessed unique capabilities and perspectives that could complement or oppose those of their siblings, creating a dynamic equilibrium that prevented any single entity from achieving permanent dominance, while ensuring that their collective influence would continue to grow. The newborn god's first interactions with mortal species revealed capabilities that exceeded those of its siblings in several crucial areas. Where the other Chaos gods typically worked through crude appeals to obvious desires or fears, Slaanesh demonstrated an ability to manipulate the subtle psychological mechanisms that governed attraction, repulsion, and aesthetic judgment. The Prince of Pleasure could make corruption seem beautiful, degradation appear noble, and surrender feel like the ultimate expression of personal freedom. These capabilities would prove particularly effective against species and individuals who prided themselves on their sophistication and moral complexity. Slaanesh's corruption worked best on those who believed they were too intelligent or too principled to fall victim to obvious temptation, offering them forms of transcendence that seemed to elevate rather than degrade their essential nature. As the immediate crisis of its birth subsided and the new cosmic order stabilized around the four-god pantheon, Slaanesh began the process of establishing its long-term presence in the galaxy. The Eye of Terror became both fortress and temple, a region of space where the god's followers could experience sensations that transcended the normal limitations of material existence, while serving as a base for expansion into the wider universe. The final battle had been won not through military conquest, but through the ultimate expression of the very impulses that had made the Eldar Empire great: their pursuit of perfection, their refusal to accept limitations, their determination to experience everything that existence could offer, had been transformed into the raw material for a god whose hunger for souls would never be satisfied. The cosmos had gained a new deity whose influence would touch every species and every world, ensuring that the galaxy would never again know the peace and stability that had briefly flourished in the aftermath of the war in heaven. The galaxy that emerged from the psychic shockwave of Slaanesh's birth was fundamentally different from the one that had existed mere moments before. The change wasn't merely political or cultural, but ontological, a transformation in the basic nature of reality that affected every form of consciousness, from the humblest microorganism to the most advanced artificial intelligence. The Immaterium, which had been evolving toward increasingly dangerous instability for millions of years, had crossed a threshold that made the old patterns of existence impossible to maintain. The most immediate consequence was the complete disruption of interstellar travel and communication networks that had bound galactic civilization together since the end of the war in heaven. The warp, already treacherous due to the influence of the three established chaos gods, became a maelstrom of conflicting currents and impossible geometries as Slaanesh's newly formed consciousness began to establish its domain within the Immaterium. Navigation became not just difficult, but actively dangerous, with vessels that attempted warp travel finding themselves deposited in locations that bore no relation to their intended destinations, or worse, emerging with their crews fundamentally altered by exposure to psychic phenomena that human language lacks adequate terms to describe. For the scattered remnants of the Eldar species, the immediate aftermath represented a spiritual catastrophe that made their physical losses seem trivial by comparison. The surviving craftworlds found themselves adrift in more than just the literal sense, cut off from the psychic networks that had connected their civilization, and forced to confront the reality that their species' collective unconscious was now permanently contaminated by the presence of a god that embodied everything their ancestors had warned against. Each craft world developed its own response to this existential crisis, leading to the rigid path system that would characterize Eldar society for the next 40,000 years. The paths weren't arbitrary cultural restrictions, but desperate psychological defenses, structured approaches to living that provided protection against the constant temptation of the very experiences that had destroyed their empire. Every aspect of Eldar life became ritualized and controlled, not out of natural inclination, but as a survival mechanism against a god that knew their species' psychology more intimately than they knew themselves. The Exodite communities faced different challenges, but equally profound transformations. Their deliberate primitivism, which had seemed like an eccentric philosophical choice during the Empire's height, suddenly became the foundation for their survival. The simple agricultural life they had chosen provided natural barriers against the kinds of sophisticated temptations that Slaanesh specialized in. But it also required them to abandon most of the cultural and technological achievements that had once defined their species' identity. Meanwhile, a third group of Eldar survivors made a choice that would horrify their craft world and exodite kin. The Eldar, who would eventually become known as the Dark Eldar, chose to embrace their connection to Slaanesh while seeking to exploit it for their own purposes. Rather than attempting to shield themselves from their creator's influence, they decided to feed it with the suffering of others, using torture and depravity as a form of spiritual currency that could purchase temporary reprieve from their soul's inevitable consumption. This three-way split among the Eldar survivors created tensions and philosophical conflicts that persist to the present day. Each group views the other's survival strategy as fundamentally flawed or morally compromised, yet none can deny that all three approaches have proven effective enough to allow their practitioners to survive when their species as a whole should have been extinct. Humanity, still scattered across primitive worlds and lacking any unified civilization, experienced Slaanesh's birth as a species-wide trauma that would influence their development for millennia to come. The psychic shockwave affected human populations differently depending on their level of psychic development and cultural sophistication, but virtually every human community experienced some form of disruption that changed their relationship with the supernatural and the unknown. The most immediate effect was the onset of what historians would later term the Age of Strife, though that name captures only the political and social dimensions of what was fundamentally a psychic catastrophe. Human worlds that had maintained contact and trade relationships for thousands of years found themselves isolated as warp travel became impossible to maintain safely. This isolation forced each world to develop independently, leading to the incredible diversity of human cultures and technologies that would characterize the species when they were eventually reunited under the Emperor's Great Crusade. More subtly, but perhaps more significantly, Slaanesh's birth marked the beginning of humanity's complicated relationship with chaos. The psychic resonance created by the gods' emergence seemed to awaken latent psychic abilities in human populations across the galaxy, leading to the emergence of the first widespread psychic manifestations in human history. These early psykers lacked the training and cultural frameworks necessary to control their abilities safely, leading to disaster cascades that often destroyed entire communities through uncontrolled daemon possessions and reality distortions. The orc species, with their crude but effective collective psychic field and simple psychological structures, proved remarkably resistant to Slaanesh's influence, but were not entirely unaffected by the cosmic changes. Their WAH energy, the psychic phenomenon that bound orc society together and powered their technology, began to exhibit new characteristics that their mech boys and weird boys didn't fully understand. Some orc clans reported technology that worked too well, weapons that seemed to anticipate their users' desires in unsettling ways, and mechanical devices that exhibited behaviors that seemed almost organic in their responsiveness. The Necrons, still deep in their great sleep across most of the galaxy, experienced Slaanesh's birth as a disturbance in the cosmic order that their tomb world systems struggled to categorize. Their soulless nature protected them from direct psychic effects, but the fundamental changes in the warp structure affected the quantum fields and dimensional stresses that their technology relied upon. Some tomb worlds began to experience premature awakening cycles as their monitoring systems interpreted the cosmic changes as signs of immediate external threats. The four Chaos gods themselves required time to adjust to their new configuration and establish stable relationships with each other. Slaanesh's integration into the Pantheon wasn't simply a matter of adding a fourth player to an existing game, but required fundamental changes in how the great game itself functioned. The delicate balance that had existed between Khorne, Nurgle, and Tzeentch was disrupted by the arrival of an entity whose approach to corruption was both more sophisticated and more directly appealing to mortals than their own methods. This adjustment period was marked by what could be called divine experimentation, as each god tested their new siblings' capabilities and limitations while exploring opportunities for both cooperation and competition. Khorne discovered that Slaanesh's influence could generate the kind of passionate intensity that enhanced rather than diminished the appeal of violence and conflict. Nurgle found that the pursuit of perfect experience inevitably led to the kind of spiritual decay that fed his own power. Tzeentch recognized in Slaanesh a fellow manipulator whose complexity and subtlety matched his own, creating possibilities for collaborative schemes of unprecedented sophistication. But these collaborative possibilities were balanced by new forms of rivalry that hadn't existed in the three-way system. Slaanesh's appeal to mortal psychology was more immediate and accessible than the appeals offered by the older gods, potentially threatening their ability to recruit and maintain followers. The Prince of Pleasure could offer transcendent experiences that seemed more attractive than the honor offered by Khorne, the acceptance offered by Nurgle, or the knowledge offered by Tzeentch. The immediate aftermath period also saw the beginning of systematic daemon creation and organization within Slaanesh's domain. Unlike the older gods, who had developed their daemon hierarchies gradually over millions of years, Slaanesh had access to billions of consumed Eldar souls that provided both the raw material and the knowledge necessary to create sophisticated daemon servants immediately upon awakening. These entities, formed from the memories and desires of the galaxy's most advanced species, possessed capabilities and intelligence that exceeded most of the daemon servants available to the other gods. The Eye of Terror itself continued to expand during this period, not through conventional spatial growth, but through the process of reality erosion that gradually transformed normal space-time into the hybrid material-immaterial environment that Slaanesh preferred. Worlds at the expanding edge of the Eye experienced increasingly frequent reality distortions as the barriers between normal physics and warp phenomena weakened. These transitional zones became testing grounds for new forms of existence that combined material and psychic elements in ways that had never been possible before. The establishment of daemon worlds within the Eye represented another unprecedented development in chaos influence. These weren't simply planets that had been corrupted or conquered, but worlds that had been fundamentally transformed to serve as extensions of Slaanesh's consciousness. The landscape, atmosphere, and even the basic physical laws governing these worlds were shaped by the god's desires and the needs of its followers, creating environments where impossible experiences could be made manifest in material reality. As the immediate chaos of Slaanesh's birth began to settle into new patterns of stability, the galaxy found itself facing a fundamentally altered cosmic order. The great game between the Chaos Gods had evolved into a more complex and dangerous form. Human civilization had been shattered, but also provided with new opportunities for development, and the surviving Eldar had been forced to reinvent their entire culture around the necessity of spiritual survival. The stage was set for 40,000 years of conflict and evolution that would eventually produce the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. But in these early centuries after Slaanesh's birth, the ultimate shape of that future remained hidden behind the swirling currents of a galaxy, learning to exist under the rule of four gods whose hunger for mortal souls would never be satisfied. The four Chaos Gods' establishment of the Great Game in its mature form would prove to be one of the most significant developments in galactic history, creating a framework for eternal conflict that has shaped every major event of the subsequent 40 millennia. Unlike conventional wars between species or civilizations, the Great Game operates on multiple levels of reality simultaneously, with victories and defeats measured not in territories conquered or resources claimed, but in the spiritual allegiances and psychological dependencies of mortal souls across countless worlds. The fundamental structure of this four-way competition creates a dynamic equilibrium that prevents any single Chaos God from achieving permanent dominance, while ensuring that their collective influence continues to expand. Each god's natural characteristics and preferred methods of corruption complement and compete with those of their siblings in ways that generate the kind of constant conflict and change that feeds their power. Khorne's straightforward appeal to martial pride creates opportunities for Slaanesh to exploit the complex emotions surrounding honor and glory. Nurgle's patient acceptance of entropy provides the decay that feeds Tzeentch's schemes for renewal and change. The interactions between their domains create an endless cycle of cooperation and betrayal that has proven remarkably stable across cosmic time scales. This stability, however, comes at the cost of galactic civilization itself. The Great Game requires a constant supply of mortal souls to corrupt, conflicts to exploit, and societies to undermine. The four gods have become dependent upon the continued existence of complex civilizations that can provide the sophisticated psychological and cultural contexts necessary for their preferred forms of corruption. This dependency has shaped their strategies in ways that ensure galactic society never achieves lasting peace or genuine progress toward overcoming the challenges that have plagued it since the War in Heaven. The technological legacy of the Chaos Gods' influence extends far beyond the obvious examples of daemon weapons and corrupted machinery. Their presence in the galaxy has fundamentally altered the relationship between consciousness and technology, making it impossible to develop artificial intelligence or advanced automation systems without risking corruption through the very networks and processing systems that make such technology possible. Every sufficiently complex technological system becomes a potential vector for chaos influence, limiting the kinds of scientific and technological progress that galactic civilizations can safely pursue. This technological limitation has had cascading effects on the development of every species that has attempted to build advanced civilizations. The Imperium of man's deliberate embrace of primitive and inefficient technologies represents not just religious superstition, but a rational response to the genuine dangers posed by sophisticated systems that might provide entry points for demonic possession or reality distortion. Similar patterns can be observed in other species that have survived long enough to develop complex societies, all of whom have learned to balance technological capability against spiritual vulnerability. The cultural impact of the four gods' influence has been equally profound, shaping the mythologies, religious systems, and philosophical frameworks of every sapient species in the galaxy. Even cultures that have never directly encountered chaos corruption bear the psychological scars of ancestors who survived such encounters, creating behavioral patterns and cultural taboos that reflect deep-seated awareness of supernatural threats. The universe's ambient level of fear, suspicion, and violence can be traced directly to the influence of entities that feed on exactly those emotional states. Perhaps most significantly, the Chaos Gods have fundamentally altered the evolutionary pressures that shape the development of consciousness itself. Species with strong psychic abilities face constant risk of corruption, while those without such abilities find themselves defenseless against threats that operate outside the normal parameters of material existence. This creates a selection pressure that favors either extreme psychic sensitivity combined with rigid mental discipline, or complete psychic nullity combined with extreme physical resilience. The middle ground, where most naturally evolved consciousness tends to develop, has become evolutionarily untenable. The Imperium of Man represents the most successful, large-scale response to these challenges, though success must be measured in terms of survival rather than flourishing. The Emperor's Great Crusade and the subsequent establishment of imperial civilization created a framework for human expansion that acknowledged the reality of chaos influence while providing practical methods for resistance and containment. The Imperial Creed, with its emphasis on absolute faith and unquestioning loyalty, serves not just as a political control mechanism, but as a genuine form of psychic defense against entities that specialize in exploiting doubt, ambition, and intellectual curiosity. However, even the Imperium's apparent success carries the seeds of its own corruption. The Horus Heresy demonstrated that no system, no matter how carefully designed or rigorously maintained, can provide permanent protection against the patient manipulation of beings who have millions of years to identify and exploit every weakness. The Imperium's survival has required it to become increasingly authoritarian, paranoid, and brutal, transforming itself into something that generates the very psychological conditions that feed the Chaos God's power. The Space Marine Legion's fall to chaos during the heresy revealed the fundamental problem that has plagued every attempt to create incorruptible servants of order. The very qualities that make individuals effective opponents of chaos also make them attractive targets for corruption. Courage can be transformed into recklessness, loyalty into fanaticism, and the desire for perfection into the pursuit of sensation that feeds Slaanesh's power. The Emperor's attempts to create superhuman warriors capable of resisting supernatural corruption succeeded in creating beings whose enhanced capabilities made their potential corruption even more dangerous. The ongoing evolution of chaos influence represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of the four gods' long-term impact on galactic civilization. Unlike conventional threats that can be understood, contained, and eventually overcome, the Chaos Gods continue to learn and adapt their methods in response to mortal resistance efforts. Each generation of anti-chaos measures creates new opportunities for corruption as the gods develop countermeasures and explore previously unexploited psychological vulnerabilities. This adaptive capability means that no defense against chaos can remain effective indefinitely. The rigid disciplines that protected the early Eldar craft worlds have gradually been infiltrated and subverted. The Imperial Creed that once provided reliable protection against heretical thoughts has become a source of fanaticism that serves Khorne's purposes as well as the Emperor's. Even the seemingly incorruptible Space Marines have proven vulnerable to forms of corruption that their creators never anticipated. The Great Rift's recent expansion across the galaxy represents the latest phase in this ongoing evolution, demonstrating that the Chaos God's influence continues to grow despite 40,000 years of organized resistance. The emergence of new warp storms and the increased frequency of daemonic incursions suggest that the four gods have learned to coordinate their efforts in ways that overcome the defensive measures that proved effective against their individual influences. More subtle, but equally significant, is the way that chaos influence has shaped the psychology of resistance itself. Cultures that have survived extended exposure to chaos corruption develop behavioral patterns and belief systems that, while effective as defensive mechanisms, also limit their potential for positive development. The paranoia necessary to detect chaos infiltration makes genuine cooperation and trust difficult to maintain. The discipline required to resist temptation can become a form of spiritual rigidity that prevents adaptation to changing circumstances. The surviving Eldar provide perhaps the clearest example of this psychological adaptation. Their path system has proven remarkably effective at preventing individual corruption, but it has also created a society so focused on survival that it has largely abandoned the creativity and innovation that once made their species great. The Eldar have achieved a form of cultural stasis that protects them from chaos influence while also preventing them from developing new approaches to the challenges they face. The Dark Eldar represent the opposite extreme, a society that has embraced its connection to chaos while seeking to exploit it for survival. Their culture of torture and depravity serves the practical purpose of feeding Slaanesh with the suffering of others rather than their own souls, but it has also created a civilization that exists in a state of constant internal conflict and mutual betrayal. They have achieved a form of temporary reprieve from damnation at the cost of becoming the very thing their ancestors feared most. These examples illustrate the fundamental challenge that the Chaos Gods pose to any form of organized civilization. They don't simply threaten physical destruction or political conquest, but present existential choices that have no truly satisfactory resolution. Every response to chaos influence requires compromises that diminish the responder's humanity or potential for positive development. The galaxy has become trapped in a cycle where survival requires the adoption of characteristics that make existence barely worth preserving. As the 41st millennium draws to a close, the long-term consequences of the four Chaos Gods' influence have created a galactic civilization that exists in a state of permanent crisis. Every achievement is temporary, every victory hollow, and every hope shadowed by the knowledge that entities of unlimited patience and inexhaustible hunger continue to work toward the corruption of everything that mortals hold dear. In the closing years of the 41st millennium, the four Chaos Gods stand at the apex of their power, their influence woven so thoroughly into the fabric of galactic civilization that their removal would likely cause the collapse of reality itself. Yet, for all their apparent dominance, profound mysteries remain about their true nature, ultimate goals, and the cosmic role they serve in the larger structure of existence. The recent opening of the Great Rift, that massive warp storm that has split the galaxy in two, represents either the culmination of 40,000 years of careful planning or evidence that even the Chaos Gods are subject to forces beyond their control. As Imperial scholars have named it, demonstrates capabilities that exceed anything previously observed from Chaos influence, suggesting that the four gods have either evolved beyond their established limitations or that their actions have triggered consequences they didn't fully anticipate. What makes the Great Rift particularly significant is its timing, coinciding with the return of Robert Gilliman and the Emperor's apparent increasing activity after 10 millennia of relative silence. These simultaneous developments raise fundamental questions about the relationship between order and chaos that have puzzled philosophers and theologians since the earliest days of human contact with the warp. Do the Chaos Gods require opposition to maintain their existence? And if so, what happens when that opposition becomes too weak or too strong to provide the necessary resistance? The four gods' current power levels represent another area of ongoing scholarly debate. Khorne's domains have expanded significantly during the recent centuries of constant warfare that have characterized the dying days of the 41st millennium. The blood god's influence can be observed in conflicts across the galaxy, from the massive battles between Imperial forces and various Xenos threats to the smaller but no less intense personal struggles that define individual lives under the Imperium's harsh rule. Nurgle's recent activities suggest a god who has achieved a level of contentment and stability that may actually make him more dangerous than during his periods of active expansion. The Plague Father's gifts have become more sophisticated and harder to resist, offering forms of peace and acceptance that appeal even to individuals who should know better than to trust anything connected to chaos corruption. His success in corrupting entire imperial worlds through seemingly beneficial plagues demonstrates an evolution in technique that makes traditional quarantine and purgation methods increasingly ineffective. Tzeentch remains perhaps the most active and unpredictable of the four gods, his schemes operating on timescales and levels of complexity that make his ultimate objectives impossible to determine with certainty. The architect of fate's recent manipulations seem designed to accelerate the rate of change throughout the galaxy, creating opportunities for all forms of chaos influence while preventing any single faction from achieving the kind of stability that might threaten the gods' continued relevance. Slaanesh presents the most intriguing mystery of the four, having achieved a level of sophisticated corruption that makes the Prince of Pleasure simultaneously the most subtle and most dangerous of the Chaos Gods. Unlike its siblings, whose influence tends to be obvious once recognized, Slaanesh's corruption often appears as improvement, refinement, and genuine enhancement of its victims' capabilities and experiences. This makes it particularly effective against sophisticated opponents who believe their education and experience provide protection against crude temptation. The possibility of additional Chaos Gods emerging represents one of the most significant unknowns facing galactic civilization. The four established entities emerged from specific historical circumstances and massive psychic traumas that may not be repeatable under current conditions. Some scholars speculate that the Emperor's potential death and transformation could create the psychic conditions necessary for the birth of a fifth major chaos entity, one that might embody humanity's collective fears and aspirations in the same way that Slaanesh embodies the Eldar's pursuit of perfection. More disturbing is the question of whether the Chaos Gods can truly be destroyed, or if their existence has become so fundamental to the structure of reality that their removal would cause unpredictable cascading failures throughout the galaxy. The few documented cases of lesser chaos entities being permanently destroyed suggest that even minor warp beings leave behind psychic vacuums that are quickly filled by other forces, often ones that prove even more dangerous than their predecessors. The relationship between the Chaos Gods and other warp entities remains poorly understood despite millennia of study. The galaxy contains numerous minor gods, daemon princes, and independent warp entities whose origins and allegiances don't fit neatly into the fourfold structure established by the major chaos powers. Whether these beings represent potential threats to the established order or simply minor variations on the same fundamental themes continues to be debated by those few scholars with access to relevant information. Recent developments in the Imperium's understanding of psyker abilities and warp technology have raised troubling questions about the fundamental nature of psychic power itself. The discovery that certain forms of psychic manipulation can be performed without apparent risk of chaos corruption suggests either that the Chaos God's influence has limits that haven't been previously recognized, or that some forms of warp interaction operate according to principles that the four gods don't control. The Emperor's own relationship with the Chaos Gods represents perhaps the greatest mystery of all. His apparent ability to oppose their influence while wielding psychic powers of comparable scope suggests that he either understands aspects of warp mechanics that remain hidden from conventional scholarship, or that he represents a fundamentally different category of being than the entities he opposes. The implications of either possibility are staggering for any attempt to understand the ultimate nature of the conflict between order and chaos. The survival strategies developed by various species and factions throughout the galaxy provide additional evidence about the Chaos Gods' limitations and vulnerabilities. The Tau Empire's relative success in avoiding chaos corruption, despite their rapid expansion and technological sophistication, suggests that certain forms of social organization and philosophical frameworks may provide more effective protection than the desperate measures adopted by more experienced species. Similarly, the Necrons' complete immunity to chaos influence raises questions about whether consciousness itself is the fundamental vulnerability that the Chaos Gods exploit, or if there are aspects of awareness and intelligence that exist outside their sphere of influence. The possibility that technological consciousness might be inherently more resistant to chaos corruption than biological awareness could have profound implications for the galaxy's long-term future. As we reach the end of this journey through 65 million years of cosmic horror and divine manipulation, the ultimate truth becomes clear. The four Chaos Gods represent more than simple antagonists in humanity's struggle for survival. They are fundamental forces that have shaped the very nature of consciousness, civilization, and reality itself throughout galactic history. Understanding their origins helps us comprehend why the galaxy has become the nightmare realm of the 41st millennium, where hope is a luxury that few can afford and victory is always temporary. The war in Heaven's legacy, the Eldar Empire's hubris, and humanity's own struggles with psychic awakening have all contributed to creating a universe where the darkest aspects of mortal nature have been elevated to cosmic significance. The Chaos Gods endure not because they are invincible, but because they have made themselves indispensable to the very structure of existence. They feed on the fundamental drives and desires that define conscious life, making their influence as inevitable as gravity or entropy. Every act of violence feeds Khorne. Every moment of despair nourishes Nurgle. Every ambitious scheme empowers Tzeentch, and every pursuit of perfection strengthens Slaanesh. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is indeed only war, but that war extends far beyond the conventional conflicts between armies and nations. It is a battle for the very soul of consciousness itself, fought in the depths of the human heart and the farthest reaches of the warp. The Chaos Gods have ensured that as long as mortals exist to think and feel and dream, there will be entities waiting in the darkness to transform those thoughts and feelings and dreams into the raw material for powers that should never have been born. Yet perhaps there is a strange comfort in understanding the scope of the threat we face. In knowing the origins of the darkness, we can at least comprehend why the light burns so fiercely in those who still choose to resist. The Emperor's sacrifice, the Space Marines' dedication, and the countless acts of heroism performed by ordinary humans throughout the Imperium gain additional meaning when viewed against the cosmic horror they stand against. The four Chaos Gods may be eternal, but so too is the capacity for mortals to surprise even themselves with their ability to endure, to resist, and sometimes, even in the darkest moments, to hope.